The story began when our MC, Logan, was seen as good for nothing after losing to his younger brother Ronian despite having training, which turned Logan into the laughingstock of the McLean family. Logan, driven mad by inferiority, had harmed his brother, and for that sin he was cast out by his father. He became a mercenary, and only after 10 years of hardship did he truly realize the depth of his wrongdoing, but by then it was far too late. When Logan returned to the city, he heard that Ronian was to be publicly executed. He ran desperately to see his brother one last time, but when he arrived, the executioner held up Ronian's head before the cheering crowd, calling it the end of a fool. That day, Logan swore he would have revenge on the Empire for finishing his family and robbing him of the chance to beg for forgiveness. In the present, far away in a hidden place, a group of mercenaries gathered to plot the Empire's downfall. The leader assigns them roles, then his attention turned to one man whose role was far more important than the rest, Logan. The leader ordered him to protect the secret book, which contains powerful secrets. Logan, already aware of the importance, agreed. One of the men remarked that Logan was patriotic, but Logan said it was not about patriotism but revenge. Then Logan was pursued by armed guards. He had managed to secure the secret book but found himself with no escape. Realizing he could not survive, he took out a magic marble, letting it explode in his palm. The blast ended everyone instantly, including himself. Manifestation of Logan's conscience appears as he reflects on a life of regret lived solely for revenge. Later, he awoke in bed with a pounding head, confused about how it could hurt if he was dead. His thoughts were interrupted by Rick, his servant, asking how he felt, walking in like it was 30 years ago. Logan froze as Rick was supposed to be 6 feet under. Rick just looked worried, probably thinking the head injury had scrambled his master's brain settings, and ran off to call a doctor. Logan noticed the family crest everywhere and began to wonder if this was a dream. Then, a voice called him brother. It was Ronian, looking embarrassed. Logan realized this was the exact scene from that day when he had lost pathetically to Ronian. Then Logan remembered how Ronian had been slaughtered in the past. Tears welled in his eyes as he grabbed Ronian's shoulders and apologized. Later, Logan looked out the family's flag waving, realizing he had truly gone back in time. Determined to change everything this time, he asked Rick to bring him a pen and paper. When Rick finally got the items, Logan thanked him, shocking him, who had never heard such words from his arrogant master. Logan scoffed inwardly, knowing all this was the result of his actions. He reminded himself of the most important task, to record everything that would happen. The first step, however, was the War of the Fiefdom, which plunged the family into dark times. Stopping that came first, and for that he decided he must see his father. As Logan walked down the corridors, the servants trembled like they were seeing some chaotic villain. Passing a mirror, he caught his reflection and realized that his grin like a psycho murderer was not going to convince anyone of his change. At his father's door, Rick informed Patrick of Logan's arrival. Memories stirred as Logan recalled how, in his past life, he used to think of Patrick as a cruel father who heartlessly cast away his child. But now, Logan thought about how heartbroken a parent must be to make such a decision. He greeted him, feeling emotional inside. Patrick's expression remained calm, but for Logan, it had been 20 years since he had spoken to his father last. Logan stated that he wanted permission to enter isolated training on the family plot, as his mind set on a plan, strengthening the family's forces and developing weapons. Patrick asked if this was an attempt to run away after losing to Ronian. Logan denied it, saying he had realized to being foolish and immature and wanted this training to help him control that. Patrick felt the words were not an excuse and allowed it. A few days later, Logan trained alone on the family grounds, holding the book of divine sword secrets he had memorized and destroyed in his past life. Mastering it could rival the Empire's strongest, a feat once impossible for him. Now, with evolved force, he began forming a dense core that filled his body with power. By the final day, Logan had learned one of the 10 sword techniques recorded in the book. With only a 1-star core, he mastered it, realizing it was the perfect hidden trump card. He planned to report back to Patrick, though, after weeks of work reeking like a garbage dump. Back at the castle, Logan tried to enter his father's room, but was stopped by a guard who said he could not see Patrick without prior notice. Logan found the situation straw. Nearby, he overheard 2 guards mocking him, realizing that his reputation had fallen even further during his absence. The head guard, Dominant, told him to come with notice next time. Logan scoffed at the inconvenience but decided to change their opinion of him. He asked the guard's name, and when he heard it, he tossed his glove into Dominant's face, challenging him to a duel. Everyone froze in shock. Dominant stayed silent, prompting Logan to mock him about being afraid. Rick stood nearby, almost shaking, not wanting to witness his master embarrass himself. Logan taunted Dominan about being past his prime and hiding behind excuses. Dominan removed the glove with trembling hands, agreeing through clenched teeth, looking like he was ready to bite Logan. All the guards around were shocked, wondering if Logan was really going to face Dominan. They all believed he was the loser who would only end up getting beaten. As Logan overheard their gossip, he realized no one expected him to win anyway. Dominan then told him he looked pretty relaxed for what was about to happen and warned him to be careful not to get hurt, clearly irritated by the situation. Logan thought it was amusing that Dominan dared to act tough, but still lacked the courage to talk back to a family member in front of the other knights. Rick, meanwhile, was nearly trembling like a scared rat, terrified that Logan had actually chosen to fight Dominan. He feared they were all doomed if Logan lost. The referee arrived and announced that the duel would begin, reminding them that, for safety, only wooden weapons would be used. Logan shot him a cold gaze, and the referee briefly wondered if the fight should go ahead, but Logan's stubbornness left no choice. He repeated the safety rule, though he knew that for Force users, even wooden weapons could be deadly. He decided whatever happened would not be his responsibility, but silently hoped Dominan would go easy on Logan. The duel began with both fighters keeping their distance and taking their stances. Dominan started leaking aura everywhere like a busted water pipe, and the guards instantly knew he was about to go full try-hard mode. Rick, shaking like a rat in a cat cafe, squeaked that it was cheating, as seeing Dominan using force, and even the referee told Dominan to be chill. Logan, however, saw through it immediately. To him, Dominan's aura leak was a sign of poor control and inexperience. He even remarked that Dominan seemed worked up and asked if he was all right, which only made the older knight more annoyed. Dominan, still salty from Logan's earlier past his prime jab, and it cut deep. Years had passed, juniors had risen in rank, and now, at 40, he was the weakest in the order. He had already decided to retire and had stopped caring about fighting, but Logan's comment struck his pride. Fueled by anger, Dominan lunged forward with all his force. Rick started begging the referee to stop it before his master got turned into a pancake. Dominan aimed to finish the match with his secret technique, the mighty triple end, but Logan easily pinned his sword to the ground. He told Dominan that if he called himself a knight, he should do better than that. The spectators were stunned. The move was so fast they barely saw anything, and now they were forced to believe Logan was a force user. Logan, seeing Dominan on his knees, told the referee he wanted to give him another chance. The referee agreed and, with a jab at Dominan's pride, asked if he was done shaking in fear. Dominan, still shocked to be losing so badly, picked up his sword and tried to strike again, but this time Logan hit him in the face and knocked him to the ground. Logan said he had already shown enough mercy, but it was time Dominan tucked his tail and accepted defeat. With his nose bleeding and pride shattered, Dominan admitted his loss. But Logan stepped forward again, deciding that punishment was still necessary for a vassal who had dared to rebel against his superior. He struck him repeatedly, like testing sword techniques on a practice dummy, leaving the others frozen in place. They could hardly believe he had changed so much in just 3 months, awakening his force and sharpening his sword skills like a man with decades of training. The referee finally declared Logan the winner. Later, Patrick, impressed by the duel, asked Logan about his training. Logan realized his father had been watching the whole time. He explained that he had let go of his greed, focused entirely on training, and eventually felt the force filling him. Though it might sound unbelievable, it was a realization he had already experienced in his past life. He had only awakened as a force user after giving up everything for revenge. Patrick said it was an empty realization and admitted Logan had certainly changed, but questioned why his first action after awakening was to assault a knight. Logan argued that Dominan deserved it and asked if his father had heard the full story from the soldiers. Patrick agreed he had, but still wondered if it was necessary to go that far. Logan insisted it was, explaining that Dominan had tried to mock and deceive the blood of his lord, which, if left unpunished, would poison the family's discipline. Logan reflected that hierarchy was the pillar that kept an organization together. When it was shaken, the entire structure faltered. From his 10 years as a mercenary, he had learned that when leading armed men, discipline must be established in one decisive strike. Today's duel, he believed, would serve as a lesson to the other knights. Patrick admitted that Dominan had been greatly at fault for forgetting his duty, but warned that Logan's actions had been a gamble. He told him to restrain himself in the future, especially since he had not yet officially received his rank. While Logan was still processing the fact that his dad was forgiving him so easily, he reminded him that his fiancée Rena would be visiting soon. Logan's face twisted into a greedy grin because his cash cow is finally coming. Not long after, Princess Rena Wolf arrived. Every maid looked stunned by her beauty, and the guards couldn't help feeling jealous of Logan. She approached, greeted Lord McLean, and asked about his well-being. Patrick was clearly surprised to see her, and Rick was in shock at how much she had grown. But when he glanced at Logan, the one who should have been the happiest, Logan didn't seem impressed at all. Renaa explained that she carried a letter entrusted to her by the Count. She began reading it aloud, addressing Patrick McLean. The letter dragged on for 30 long minutes, and everyone looked bored out of their minds. By the time she finished, the main message was clear. Due to unavoidable circumstances, House Wolves wished to break off the arranged marriage between Logan and Renaa. Logan thought they had just spent 30 minutes beating around the bush. The real meaning was obvious to him that House Wolves once thought McLean would rise as an aura user. But after being stuck as a high-ranking knight for over 20 years, Patrick's value had dropped. And as for Logan, they saw him as the worst of the worst. So why would they lower their standards for someone like him when they could simply walk away? Patrick's face hardened in fury. Breaking off the marriage without a proper reason was an insult. Renaa quickly tried to defend the decision, saying it wasn't meant as humiliation. She had even volunteered to be the envoy because she was worried and wanted to clear the misunderstanding in person. She spoke of her cherished memories from the year she spent with Logan and how she had no wish to abandon them. But she was bound by her family's will and had no choice but to follow their orders. Meeting the McLeans in person was her way of apologizing sincerely. The women in the room were touched by her words and beauty, but Logan and his stepmother Marion weren't swayed. Marion, who had always treated Logan like a rival because of succession issues, unexpectedly asked Renaa the reason for the breakup. Logan was surprised. He had thought she would stay silent, but perhaps it was about protecting the family's honor. Renaa apologized, saying she didn't know the true reason. Her father never discussed such matters with her. Instead, she delivered an offer. House Wolves would pay 3 million gold as compensation for breaking the engagement. The number alone made Dwayne McLean's greedy financial manager nearly collapse in excitement. In his mind, it was like winning the lottery. But before he could celebrate, Patrick exploded, demanding how they dared suggest such a thing. Everyone froze. Rockfern, a knight from House Wolves, stepped in, urging Patrick to calm down and talk. Patrick replied that injuring Wolves' rising star would be a fair trade for insulting McLean's honor. Rockfern insisted their lord was a man of honor who would never persecute a princess or junior. Renaa added that they weren't trying to buy honor with money, but to maintain friendship between the families despite the unavoidable circumstances. Patrick realized that pressing further might make him seem dishonorable. He knew Chiron Wolves had sent them here with a purpose. Announcing that McLean would not prosecute guests, he rejected the gold and said the only thing required in exchange for breaking the engagement was for Princess Renaa to apologize to Logan. The knights admired Patrick's nobility, but Logan broke the mood. As the person directly involved, he said he had a request: accept the gold. To him, letting them walk away with just an apology was insane. 3 million gold was a year's budget for House McLean. Half of their current funds came from his stepmother's family, Kairos, and without that they would be bankrupt. Honor meant nothing if the house collapsed. Patrick looked furious that Logan would contradict him. Logan reflected on the pressure his father faced, but also thought this was nothing compared to the kingdom's real power struggles. If Logan couldn't stand up for practicality here, he'd never progress. Patrick argued that House McLean wasn't so poor as to sell their honor for gold. Logan almost wanted to shout the truth, that they were drowning in debt and practically the kingdom's biggest beggar family, but held back since this was an official meeting. Instead, he framed it as a matter of honor, saying they should accept the money. Patrick asked if Logan wanted him to go back on his word of honor. Logan reasoned that House Wolves had a higher standing and that ending it with only an apology could make it seem like McLean bowed to them. Renaa said House Wolves respected McLean's honor, but Logan pointed out the absurdity of breaking the engagement unilaterally and still speaking of respect. Renaa was left in silence. In his mind, Logan recalled his past life. Back then, he thought Renaa had been genuinely sad about the breakup. When they were alone, she had thanked him for coming, saying they might part ways, but she wanted one last memory. Logan, desperate and heartbroken, suggested they run away together. But instead, Renaa threw a knife at him. Logan, half in shock, half in self-defense mode, pulled his sword. She immediately switched to WWE villain mode, stripping down and mocking his defeat to Ronian. Then, as the final plot twist, she played her woman card, screaming for help right as a knight burst in. With his sword already drawn, her lie was easy to believe, and his family, already disappointed in Logan, didn't defend him. McLean had to crawl to the Wolves with an apology and a fat compensation payment. That betrayal had destroyed his ability to trust bitches. Back in the present, Logan was certain Renaa was planning to pull something similar again with this so-called unavoidable breakup. This time, he wasn't going to let her get away with it. At first, Logan thought he could change his reputation in the family. He figured that if he slowly showed them how he had changed and convinced them over time, then maybe the family would change too. That was what he believed, but his fight with Dominion made him realize the truth. The soldiers had turned a blind eye even when someone openly disrespected him, and rumors had spread while he was away. Thinking about it, he knew it was pointless to try transforming the family by seeking acknowledgement from people like that. There were only 9 months left before the regional war. His reputation didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered now was saving the family. He told Princess Rena that he would accept the compensation regardless of his family's wishes. She was stunned, Patrick was furious, and asked how Logan dared to deny his will. Logan replied that he had no interest in lip service apologies. If their honor could be compensated with words that vanished into thin air, then its worth would be just as light as those words. Rena then spoke, saying the wolves wished to obey Patrick's will as the head of House McLean and asked for his decision. Seeing her act this way, Logan quickly realized she was probably terrified at the thought of actually paying the $3 million. Patrick finally declared that as the representative of House McLean, he was satisfied with a sincere apology. However, he would leave the final decision to Logan if the apology was sincere. He warned his son to think carefully. Logan thought of apologizing to his father, but he couldn't give in either. He declared that, as the person directly concerned with the breaking of the engagement, he would accept the compensation offered by House Wolves. Patrick heard this and sorrowfully realized Logan had changed for the worse, blaming himself for not teaching him the true value of honor. Logan, however, only thought about how he was doing this for the sake of the family. Later in his room, Logan finally received the $3 million gold. A knock came at the door, and the family's financial manager, Dwayne, entered. The man's smile was so wide it looked like he'd just won the lottery. Logan instantly knew that grin wasn't for him. In truth, Dwayne felt he was facing the biggest challenge of his life. As the financial manager of House McLean, he had been running the estate on an ever-shrinking budget, dealing with soldiers who complained about running low on weapons and winter supplies. He had been making up for the lack of money by begging Patrick's in-laws like some GoFundMe campaign. Dwayne thought to himself that he wasn't a financial manager anymore. He was the boss of beggars. If this hadn't been his hometown, he would have resigned long ago. But now, thanks to this innocent little heir, he finally had enough gold to live like a king for a few years, and all Dwayne had to do was rob the clueless guy blind. He told himself that he would have to share the $3 million, and then told Logan he had just come to say hello. He complimented Logan for standing up for himself without caving in to outside pressure, saying it was a display truly fitting of the McLean heir. Inside, Dwayne thought this was probably the first time Logan had ever received flattery, hoping it would soften him up. Logan, however, felt gross listening to him. Dwayne went on to say that in these hard times, $3 million gold was like rain in a drought, and Logan's wits had given the family a huge sigh of relief. Logan instantly clapped back, asking why the family was sighing in relief when it was his money. That's when Dwayne realized this greedy little rascal really planned to keep it all. Swallowing his irritation, he told himself to be patient. Drawing from 20 years as a financial manager at McLean, Dwayne was used to groveling, and this was no different. He even started crying, which surprised Logan, as if realizing the family situation was worse than he thought. Dwayne told him they owed the bank $3 million gold, with annual interest of $150,000. He asked if Logan knew about it. Logan reminded him that it was harvest time, so Dwayne should be able to pay off the interest through the crops. Dwayne regretted letting him know so much already and tried to convince him the budget was still tight. He asked Logan for help, but Logan refused, shocking him. Logan said he would use the money for the family's sake, but not for immediate running costs. He needed to think ahead. Paying off the debt would change nothing, and they would be in debt again. They didn't have any specialty products, and it was a vicious cycle. He intended to break that cycle and would use the gold for his own plan. Dwayne was stunned, wondering if this was really the same foolish man who never cared about family affairs. Logan then asked for a favor. If Dwayne helped him, he might cover some of the family's expenses. He needed him to gather some mercenaries. Later, Rick was shocked to see Logan ready to leave again, stopping him and pointing out it hadn't been long since he returned from solitary training. Logan surprised him by saying he wanted to earn more money, as he needed much more. Rick reminded him that Lord Patrick would never allow it, especially with the tense atmosphere in the castle. Logan explained that was exactly why he planned to sneak out. He knew that if he couldn't overturn his reputation now, he couldn't change anything here, so he needed to create forces outside. Luckily, he was familiar with what was happening at this time. In his past life, this was when the family had kicked him out, and he had traveled around the kingdom. His first goal was to scout a certain man who could put some sense into his master. Rick blocked him, saying he would have to cross his body first. Logan didn't really care, stepping over Rick, then told him not to worry, he would leave a letter for his father so no one would blame Rick. Rick sighed in relief. After Logan left, Rick delivered the letter to Patrick. The Lord's temper flared when he read it. The letter said that, heartbroken by the engagement breakup, Logan had decided to get some air and would return soon. Rick could only cry, wishing for this madman to come back safely. 200 years ago, the McLean family was nothing like it is now. Back then, their vast territory stretched from the neighboring Tesron Viscounty to the Sylvan and Parana Viscounties, and even included the Bifrons Plains. They were respected as the rulers of the southwestern region of the Grandia Kingdom. But over the last 3 generations, the incompetence of their lords led to their title being demoted. Their lands shrank drastically. The rich McLean Plains with its endless grain was given to their most powerful vassal, and the rest of their fertile territory was split among other lords. What they were left with was a rough, dry land at the edge of the southern mountains. There were no notable regional products, and unlike most mountainous territories, there were no copper ore mines. Logan thought that even if they somehow won the upcoming regional war, they would still be stuck relying on Kairos for help. To break this vicious cycle, they needed a lot more than the 3 million gold he currently had. There was only one person who could give him that kind of money, and right now, that person was somewhere in Grandia Kingdom's greatest trading city, Kyle. The streets of Kyle were alive with merchants shouting to customers about their goods, a reminder to Logan of just how remote McLean had become. Based on his memory, the person he was looking for had spent their youth here. Locals said he still lived somewhere nearby. His name was Philip Claude, known as the Gold Bug. The Ares Empire, the strongest nation on the continent, was a merit-based society where anyone, regardless of gender or age, could gain wealth and influence if they had talent. Even foreigners could rise. Philip Claude was one such example, a Grandia native who had become one of the empire's richest merchants and its most famous arms dealer. Many in Grandia called him a traitor, but in truth, he often supported his homeland in secret, using his wealth and influence to help create the so-called miracle of Grandia's sovereignty. As Logan walked the streets, he spotted a miserable-looking man. If his memory was right, that was Philip, and it seemed he had just been scammed. The man looked ready to throw himself off a bridge out of regret. Logan approached him and asked if he was Philip. Philip confirmed and asked about Logan's business. Logan said he wanted to talk if Philip had time, but Philip was already suspicious, wondering how this stranger knew him. Philip noticed a sharp gleam in Logan's eyes, the kind of ambition he had seen countless times in businessmen. Judging by the worn armor, Philip assumed Logan was just another mercenary thug. Before Logan could introduce himself, Philip shouted that the repayment date wasn't yet due, that the sale proceeds from a property would come in 3 days, and told him to leave. Logan insisted he wasn't there to collect debts, but Philip barked at him again to get lost. Logan stayed calm and said he wanted to invest money in him. That caught Philip off guard. He asked how much Logan wanted to invest, but Logan instead asked how much Philip needed enough to clear his debts and make a comeback. Philip still doubted him. Looking over Logan's dirty armor, he wondered if this man had traveled far. Then, recognizing the crest, Philip sneered that Logan was from the McLean family, the so-called beggar nobles who survived off their in-laws. Philip said that if Logan was impersonating a noble, he could be executed. He declared he was truly broke. Logan, however, admired that even at rock bottom, Philip's instincts were sharp, just as expected from a future business giant. He needed to win him over. Logan revealed his aura, stunning Philip. As he was a young man with awakened force wasn't something to see every day. Embarrassed, Philip apologized and asked what Logan really wanted. Logan said he wanted to hire him for life, with paying off his debts just being a bonus. Philip laughed it off, saying the McLeans didn't have the money for that until Logan took off his bag and asked about the amount of debt. When Logan offered 30 million gold, Philip froze. All that gold in cash was laid before him, and in that moment Logan looked like an angel. Soon after, they signed a magic contract prepared by a mage. The terms were simple. If the subordinate intentionally harmed the boss, they would feel unbearable pain, as if their soul were being ripped apart. The mage explained that the only ways to break it were for Philip to become a high-ranked knight himself, or to hire a powerful mage, both options costing far more than the contract's value. On the way back, Philip realized he had speedrun his way into a lifetime of slavery. Just one page of that contract was worth the price of 30 slaves. Logan explained that since this was their first meeting, he needed a safeguard when investing such a fortune, but promised they could dissolve the contract once trust was built. Philip thought it was the kind of deal only a drunk raccoon would sign, but he had no choice but to nod along like a broke guy. When Philip asked what to do first, Logan told him to buy monster meat. Philip laughed and called him insane. Monster meat and blood were poisonous, and everyone knew they should be burned. But Logan knew the truth. In a few years, research would prove that monster blood could be neutralized with common ingredients, making it safe to eat. Some regions would even use it as food during shortages. Then reports would spread about a certain monster species, the Kalok, whose meat improved virility and even cured certain disabilities. Once the Royal Mage Tower confirmed it, Kalok would vanish from the continent, hunted to extinction. Logan thought that with this plan, he could make far more than 30 million. Meanwhile, Philip walked beside him, silently wondering if he should run away from this madman. In a tavern, Logan told Philip to spend 1 million on monster meat, which almost made Philip lose his mind. Logan told him to calm down, saying that even if he spent more, the profit from this investment would be enormous. Philip asked if he was sure, and Logan confirmed it. Philip then asked what Logan thought about the unit price of the Karok monster. Logan said Karok meat had no value nowadays and was more likely to be burned since no one lived near its habitat. He explained that if they asked for payment just to bring the carcass, the transportation fees within the kingdom would be about 200 gold coins. If Philip hunted more Karok and transported them at once, the cost would be much cheaper. Philip commented that setting the unit value and the 1 million budget was not exaggerated. Philip asked if Logan planned to buy it after the kingdom's hunting request to the Mercenaries Guild, and Logan agreed. Philip remarked that monsters, meat was being disposed of these days, and suggested checking the price of beef instead. He reasoned that many merchants would sell anything for money, even garbage, and might even give away all the Karok meat in the kingdom. Logan thought Philip deserved the money he had spent on him and considered him a brilliant guy. Philip told Logan not to worry about the money and to leave it to him since his future was now in Logan's hands. Logan gave him a list of items to buy in large quantities while staying in Kyle. Seeing the list, Philip wondered if Logan planned to produce and sell toys, not knowing the materials were for weapons. These weapons were the same type that the kingdom had used to conquer Grandia in Logan's past life. Depending on the battle, a soldier could stop a knight with them. Before leaving, Logan entrusted Dewin with hearing mercenaries, knowing that with these weapons, they would have the upper hand in the regional war. He thought they would first need an engineer to make the weapons and instructors to train the mercenaries, with plenty of other preparations ahead. 2 days later in Harran, the mercenary city, Logan sought out rank a mercenary Kaisalan to hire as a trainer for the C-rank mercenaries he planned to recruit. Kaisalan only taught youngsters some tricks, but Logan already knew him from his past life as someone who could handle any weapon and was a great horseman. His value would rise greatly as a trainer, though in the past, when he retired due to injuries, the mercenary army he trained got cocky and collapsed like a Jenga tower. Now he had no intention of joining anyone again. But Logan knew it'd take money to lure him in, so he started with an offer of 4,000 gold coins a month. Kaisalan acted nobly and refused, saying he wasn't a trainer. Logan upped the gold, and Kaisalan kept saying he preferred fighting tasks. Logan almost gave up until he dangled 8,000 gold coins, at which point Kaisalan's principles evaporated faster than beer at a sailor's party, and he signed up without blinking. Logan spoke about his master, Patrick, but noticed Kaisalan never asked why he wanted mercenaries in the deserted McLean territory, clearly caring only about the money. While walking through the streets, they saw a man whipping others. Kaisalan remarked that Harran was known as the city of mercenary slaves, and there would be more of this ahead, especially at the slave market. Logan already knew about the place and planned to buy a slave there later. One merchant noticed Logan and assumed he was a clueless countryman, offering to show cheap slaves, but a single glance from Kaisalan made the man tremble. Logan thought hearing slaves had been a good decision. Eventually, they arrived at a marketplace with more escorts than usual, where an old man greeted Logan and asked his purpose. Logan said he came to buy a dwarf. The old man explained that slaves of that race were rare and specially treated, showing Logan a pair of elves first. Logan instead asked for one of the dwarves chained at the back. The merchant starts hyping up the dwarf's race, saying this one would be useful for many things, as he was from the artisan dwarf race, skilled in crafting artifacts since childhood. Then he casually drops the price, 200,000 gold. Logan stiffened like someone had just unplugged his spine. 5 minutes later, the old man's confidence evaporates faster, and he's stammering out 50,000 like he just realized he accidentally tried to scam them. On the way back, the dwarf asked where they were going. Logan told him they were heading to the McLean house and that he would have to follow his orders. The dwarf agreed, though Logan knew that slave dwarves often lacked proper training despite their heritage. To motivate him, Logan promised that if he did his best for the next 20 years, he would send him back to his mountain home. Knowing 20 years was nothing for his race, the dwarf's eyes lit up. Nearby, another slave tried to escape, only to be caught by his master, and Logan took in the scene quietly. A blue-haired boy was running with his younger sister on his back, his master chasing close behind. He stumbled, fell to the ground, and they were caught. The master kicked him, furious that he dared to attempt an escape. The younger brother shouted for her to run, but it was too late. Kaisalan glanced at them and said they were just slaves, so they should be left to continue their march. Logan, however, froze for a moment. Among the captives, he saw a slave with azure hair and strange red and blue eyes. The sight stirred something in his memory. He realized he was looking at the one later known as the Noble Slayer. In his past life, Logan had heard the stories. This boy, once a slave, had escaped his master and fled. During his escape, many soldiers and knights pursuing him were slain. He went on to become a noble, becoming a wanted criminal. A decade later, he reappeared wielding force, feared as something beyond human. From then on, he hunted down every member of his former master's family and began indiscriminately slaughtering the nobles of Grandia, earning his infamous title. Logan thought back. If he remembered correctly, the escape happened about a year after the boy became a mercenary. Right now, he was still young. If Logan saved him now, he could become a powerful force user at his side in the future. However, there was a problem. The Noble Slayer was an uncontrollable murderer who could be just as dangerous to allies as to enemies. Isolating him might be the only safe option. As the master moved to strike the boy again, Logan drew his sword and blocked the blow. The man was startled, demanding to know who would dare stop him, but his attitude shifted when he spotted the McLean family crest. He laughed nervously and asked how he could help. Logan told him he wanted to buy the two slaves. The master boasted about their rare eye color and set the price at 10,000 each. Logan knew the man was overcharging, especially for half-starved children. The master thought Logan was clueless, but Logan pointed out that most of the children here were on the verge of collapse and one of them might die soon. The master argued they were the only ones available in the market, refusing to budge, until Logan made it clear he knew the real value of slaves. The threat was enough, and the master accepted his offer. Later, Kaisalan carried the injured boy on his back, nodding he had finally woken up. Logan said it was remarkable and had secretly been channeling force into the boy along the way. It was far more effective than the holy magic of low-level priests. The girl seemed to sense his power, though even Kaisalan did not notice. Logan wondered if he was imagining it. Suddenly, the boy, Victor, lunged at Logan. Logan caught him by the neck and asked if he was brave or just foolish. He told Victor to think carefully before choosing his targets and warned him that if he disobeyed, he would not only finish him but also his sister. Dropping him to the ground, Logan added that this was his final warning. If Victor followed orders, both he and his sister would be safe. Logan told him he planned to raise him into a knight. Victor was surprised, but Logan explained that it would free him from slavery and also help his sister. Victor looked at her and agreed. Logan, watching them, realized the girl might be the key to controlling the Noble Slayer's violent nature. He told them training would begin once they returned to his house. Turning to Hemmer the dwarf, Logan asked if they could talk. He presented him with a magical contract. If Hemmer worked for him for 20 years, he would be freed and sent back to the mountains where his kin lived. The dwarf, who looked like Gimli's broke cousin, was overwhelmed with emotion and agreed immediately, promising to serve with all his strength. Logan saw tears in his eyes and felt certain his expectations had been correct. With that, he had achieved everything he set out to do on this trip, and even more since he had secured the future Noble Slayer. Preparations for the regional war were moving forward smoothly. Meanwhile, Logan had no idea about that. Rumors about Logan's strange behavior had already spread throughout McLean. His reputation had fallen to rock bottom. Rick was working hard to keep the tea from leaking outside the territory, all while wondering where his headache of a master had disappeared to this time. However, it appears that Logan has returned home, Rick blushing as if he'd just seen his fiancée, not his master. Logan asked how Rick had been, to which Rick replied with disbelief, nearly having a full-blown stroke. While still wheezing from disbelief, he demands to know where his master has been. Then, with all the urgency of spilling tea, Rick warns him that the villagers are gossiping, calling him a certified monster meat enthusiast who spent heavily on it. Apparently, a few days earlier, Philip had gathered all the merchants, saying he wanted to buy monster meat while dropping Logan's name. The people had already heard about Logan and his broken engagement. Philip thought that spreading rumors about monster meat would help boost sales, but he hadn't expected Logan to already have such a bad reputation. He figured Logan was just crazy, but it turned out people saw him as an irrational loser. Even so, Philip told the merchants not to miss the chance, offering 1 gold per kilo. No merchant would refuse to sell worthless meat for that price, so he told them to bring whatever they had from Karok. With Philip's efforts, not only did merchants begin gathering monster meat, but rumors about Logan also spread to estates near Kyle. Hearing all this, Logan told Philip he had done a great job, though Rick stood confused, not understanding why. Logan then glanced at the companions he had brought, telling Rick not to worry and that he would resolve the rumors soon. Rick still wasn't at ease, knowing it was no time to relax. Later, Patrick was furious. When Logan faced him, he referred to his journey as a tour. Patrick scoffed that, judging from the rumors, it seemed Logan had gone on a wild joyride. Logan dismissed the gossip, saying he had no shame in his actions. Marion, his stepmom, stepped in, warning that Logan's actions could tarnish the family's honor. Logan countered that her words were harsh, explaining he had only spent basically his breakup bonus. Marion grew more furious and asked Patrick if he still intended to take Logan's side. Patrick, done with her soap opera episode, told her to shut up and yelled that this was between him and Logan so she could take her family honor speech somewhere else. Once alone, Patrick asked openly what was going on. Logan said even if he explained, Patrick would not understand. Patrick expressed concern about how people now saw Logan as greedy and insane, adding that he could not cover for him forever. He said that way, at least, he could tell Logan's late mother he had done his best. Hearing his mother mention a name Patrick had never spoken, even when he had kicked him out in his past life, Logan realized his father had not completely given up on her. Logan asked for just 1 year, promising that within that time, he would prove the reason for his actions. Later, Patrick sat alone in his study, thinking about the word please between him and his son. If Logan failed to prove himself after a year, a decision would have to be made. Putting aside his role as a father, he was still head of the McClane family. Looking at a picture of Logan's mother, Patrick quietly apologized, admitting he had no idea what their son was planning and promised he would protect and raise him well, regretting his carelessness. Not long after, Ronian came to see Logan. Logan was pleased to see that Ronian had already awakened his force. In his past life, Ronian had awakened much later. Ronian thanked him, saying the Knights had blocked him from meeting his brother again and that he had awakened his force just to see him. Logan was impressed and thought that once Ronian's force stabilized, if he taught him the divine sword's vision, Ronian could become even stronger than before. At the McClane Estate's vacation villa, Logan met Dewing, who informed him that, as requested, he had recruited all 350 C-rank mercenaries. All of them were gathered, though they seemed angry, wondering if Logan had scammed them. Some mocked him openly. Logan thought that anyone making a living with fists and swords needed to have some backbone. He addressed one of the men who had mocked him earlier, making the mercenary uneasy. Logan then warned them that if anyone managed to land a hit on him, he would pay them a year's wages on the spot and send them away, a promise made on his noble honor. The mercenary stepped forward, confident, and trying to intimidate him. Some whispered, wondering if he might even be B-rank as their eyes lock on the mercenary built like a vending machine with anger issues. Logan, seeing his confidence, let him speak. The man mocked him further, offering him the first move and asking if he wanted a handicap. Logan told him he would regret it. In an instant, Logan charged his force and landed a powerful punch square on the man's face. The mercenary's teeth flew through the air, and the duel ended in a single blow. The other mercenaries stared in disbelief as Logan, flexing his power, asked calmly if anyone else wanted to step forward. The mercenaries were shocked to see a force user at such a young age, and even Kaisalin, who had already thought Logan extraordinary, did not expect him to be this strong. Logan realized no one would dare challenge him now, and then introduced himself as the one who had gathered them. Since many were curious about their recruitment, he told them he planned to train them as crossbow cavalry. The mercenaries were surprised, while Kaisalin quietly commented that crossbows were not efficient weapons for cavalry. But Logan had something in mind. He knew crossbows had more destructive power than bows, but it took over a minute for an unskilled person to reload. On horseback, even carrying 3 or 4 loaded crossbows meant running out of firepower in under a minute. The astonishment was natural, but Logan remained confident. He asked Kaisalin if he thought he was just playing soldier with money, then told him to train them thoroughly and see the results later. Kaisalin agreed, and Logan believed the crossbow cavalry could become a major force for the McClane family, not just for territorial battles ahead. A few days later, Logan received a report that 312 out of the 350 mercenaries had passed the simple qualification test. He then called for the dwarf Hemmer and handed him a blueprint for crossbows. He asked if Hemmer could make them. Hemmer stayed quiet, studying the design. Logan thought an expert might find it crude, but since it was a weapon he had used for decades in his past life, he remembered and drew the basic structure. A top dwarf craftsman should be able to make it. Hemmer read that the crossbow would have automatic reloading and the ability to shoot 3 bolts in rapid succession. He immediately looked like someone just handed him a recipe for cooking rocks. Annoyed at the absurd idea, he asked if Logan was serious, who proudly said it was his idea. Hemmer tried to keep himself calm over this dumb guy's suggestion. Then Hemmer grudgingly admitted the idea was quite ingenious, before pointing out that with such a mechanism, the string would snap under the force, and shooting at a wooden box like that would be inconvenient for the shooter. Confused, Hemmer asked how this genius planned to solve it, and Logan, the forever dumbest man, told Hemmer to figure it out. Hemmer almost combusted on the spot, about to go Super Saiyan from pure rage, but Logan quickly backpedaled, saying he was kidding. They then discussed the design and materials, which lit a fire in Hemmer's craftsman pride. He agreed to take the challenge until Logan asked how long it would take. Hemmer froze, processing that this clown not only asked for an unheard-of weapon, but also dared to slap a deadline on it. But Logan, the cunning gremlin that he was, played his final card, poking Hemmer's pride by saying even humans could make this easily, and asking if he wanted to give up. Hemmer took 500 points of emotional damage to his dwarf pride and roared that in 1 month he'd make something far superior. Logan just quietly grinned. Sometime later, the blue-haired slave Victor came running during training. Logan thought it was impressive how much the boy had changed since arriving, simply from good food and rest. Victor's sister approached, and Logan noted that, despite being smaller than his peers, the boy had just run 20 kilometers without stopping. He admitted the kid's talent, especially his persistence and endurance. The brutal reputation as the noble slayer did not seem to be his true nature, so the reason for that in his previous life must have been something else. After a short rest, Logan ordered Victor to get up for the next round of training. From now on, he would learn the Grandian royal swordsmanship, something every knight trainee in the country studied. Logan swung his sword and told Victor to watch and follow. The boy was exhausted and could have fallen asleep on the spot, but the promise of good food and a comfortable bed kept him going. He copied Logan's movements exactly, even matching his breathing patterns, something not even Ronian could do at that age. Logan was satisfied. He told Victor that once he built up his strength and could flawlessly execute the kingdom's swordsmanship over 1,000 times in a row, perhaps then he could be called a knight. Victor's eyes lit up, and when Logan asked if he could do it, the boy accepted. The only thing Victor requested was that his sister be well cared for. Logan was impressed, thinking Victor might not be ready for war yet, but soon he would be a great strength to the McLean family. Logan knew the mercenary group and the weapons Hemmer was making could become tremendous forces, but he also knew it was dangerous to rely only on positive outcomes. Hemmer might fail to make the repeating crossbows, and even if they were completed, the mercenaries might not use them effectively. It felt like leaving too much in others' hands, so he needed another plan. Meanwhile, Lord Patrick was surprised when Logan said he wanted to join the night training. On the night training grounds, Logan's presence was quickly known to the other knights as Henkel, the knight commander, made the announcement. Some knights muttered that beating the Dominion must have made Logan think knights were just medieval cosplayers. Henkel remembered how Lord Patrick had told him to give Logan proper training. He had been confused, thinking it would cause dissatisfaction among the knights, but Patrick had made it clear not to give Logan any special treatment like a spoiled brat, and to treat him as a new recruit. Henkel had been unsure since Logan was the Lord's son, but Logan noticed the tension and told him not to worry. If he fell behind even once during the week of night training, he would withdraw on his own. This surprised Henkel, and he agreed. Right after hearing this, Henkel decided that for the next week the training intensity would be tripled. During one exercise, knights were carrying their peers on their backs while walking, some complaining about the point of it. Henkel shouted at them, saying knights rode horses, so they should understand how a horse felt. The knights called it nonsense, then realized the sudden harsh training was because of that troublemaker Logan, deciding they would not endure it. Their resolve faltered when Logan suddenly dashed past them like a storm, leaving them stunned. Henkel, furious, thought at this rate it would be the regular knights dropping out, not Logan, and called for a 10-minute break. While the other knights collapsed, panting heavily, Henkel approached Logan, expecting him to admit the training was too much, so they could stop. His surprised Logan, standing there like he was on a light morning jog, and casually said that the training was excellent, and that knights must be strong to do this regularly, even asking the commander for more. Meanwhile, the rest of the knights were sprawled on the ground looking like overcooked spaghetti, cursing the shameless freak. Later, when all the knights had left, Logan remained on the training ground alone. He thought the Knight Order's training was his insurance in case all his other plans failed. If it came to that, he would join the Order and fight on the front lines, so building camaraderie with them now would be useful. Physical training was just as important as growing the core force through meditation, so this would be effective. With his force core at only 1 star, he already felt significant power and hardly any fatigue. If he reached 2 stars, he believed he could match an advanced knight like his father. Next day, he tested the crossbows and rejected all of them, asking Hemmer if this was the best he could do. He rattled off defects like he was speedrunning an insult contest, demanding a rapid-fire crossbow. Hemmer's face turned red enough to fry an egg, so Logan fake apologized, claiming he'd been too harsh. Hemmer warned him not to trample a craftsman's pride, but Logan replied that if this was his best, then there was nothing more to say. The taunt nearly made Hemmer's veins pop. Logan then softened his tone, saying he had simply expected too much and spent too much money. After this back and forth, Hemmer finally agreed to remake it within a month, breaking the bow in his hands before leaving. Watching him go, Logan just stood there smiling like a madman, knowing he'd successfully baited the dwarf into making something legendary. A month later, Hemmer appeared on the training ground to show off his new design. The improved crossbow could now shoot 2 arrows at once. Hemmer explained that it was easy to hold in one hand and simple to reload with a magazine. Logan was stunned to see it could be reloaded and fired in less than 5 seconds. While its effective range and size were less than the weapon from his past life, for cavalry use this was far better. The performance was outstanding, and with months still left before the Domain War, he was pleased with the progress. Seeing Logan lost in thought, Hemmer asked if he was listening. Logan suddenly picked Hemmer up like some toddler and laughed, praising him, saying he did great. While Hemmer, blushing like his crush just noticed him, nervously whispered that anyone could be watching. Logan then locked eyes with him like some bootleg romance movie hero, making Hemmer feel way too many emotions. But then Logan flashed his usual creepy smile as grin and casually requested him to make 400 more bows within 2 months. Later, Logan handed bows to Kaislan and the other mercenaries. As they tried them out, they were all amazed at the speed and power of the shots. Kaislan examined his bow closely, realizing that a muzzle-loading crossbow with this kind of range, strength, and firing speed was frightening. Just imagining an army of 300 mounted troops equipped with these made him shudder. He praised Logan's plan, saying he now understood what Logan meant by crossbow cavalry. Logan grinned, thinking about how much effort Hemmer had put in and how, as expected of an expert-rank dwarf, his work was on another level. Logan considered sharing the weapon with the Knight Order and soldiers as well, but the issues of funding and the risk of the technology leaking made him hold off for now. He told Kaislan that starting today, the mercenaries should be equipped with crossbows and clear out the monsters outside the territory. Kaislan doubted whether it could be done, but Logan told him to do it anyway, saying that if Kaislan could not accomplish it, all of this was meaningless. Kaislan then realized Logan had not created this weapon just for monster subjugation. He was preparing the mercenaries for war. On the night training ground, the knights watched in amazement as Logan carried 2 of them on his back. They still wondered how he could have lost to his younger brother before awakening, and they were surprised to see him enduring the same intense training for a full month. The training that had originally been designed to drive him away had now become the new standard of the Knight Order. It served as an unexpected push for the lower-ranked knights who had been slacking off, and they even began to truly understand and empathize with their horses. The strengthened bonds among the knights were a welcome bonus. Henkel thought he had only continued the training because Logan refused to quit, but he could hardly believe the results. He saw Logan as a lucky charm who just showed up uninvited. At night in his room, Logan pushed his body hard with training, then stimulated his inner consciousness through meditation. The physical and mental training worked in synergy, and he was making steady progress. Lately, he had been sensing signs of a shift in the force. If his martial powers improved as he hoped, he could become a superhuman or a master or even an archmage, surpassing all the monsters he had seen in his past life. Then something strange happened. His force core suddenly grew, and he began speaking in a language he did not recognize. His core had reached 2 stars. Now he had the basics to learn the next secret technique of the sword secrets. Remembering the strength the first technique, Iron Slash, had given him, he was certain the second would be far more powerful than expected. If he could master it before the war, even a high-ranking knight would no longer intimidate him. Meanwhile, Kaislan and the mercenaries were out on training, hunting monsters. On Kaislan's command, they fired on a group of goblins, dropping them instantly. The arrows struck true, and the mercenaries were pleased. Watching the fight, Logan noted that a swarm of over 100 monsters had been wiped out in less than 10 seconds. Their old habits from using basic crossbows were fading, and they were now much faster at reloading magazines. The long trip deep into the territory had been worth it. When Kaislan asked if he was satisfied, Logan grinned and said something. He thought back to how the mercenaries had been a complete mess during their first hunt, but had improved greatly since then. Kaislan, gathering his courage, asked why Logan was doing all of this, like the guy's end goal was to speedrun monster hunting across the whole continent. Before Logan could answer, someone called out from behind. The man rushed over, saying Rick had sent him. Logan was caught off guard when the messenger announced that yesterday, Viscount Tesseron had declared war against them. In the McLean house, Patrick and the others gathered in his room, watching Viscount Tesseron through a crystal ball. Tesseron spoke of his ancestors' grudge and wrongful death, placing the blame on the McLean family. Patrick's bodyguards muttered that it was all in the past, though some worried about what Patrick would decide. Marion was tense as well, concerned for her husband. Henkel pointed out that Tesseron had twice as many knights as they did and asked if they should guard the city and call for reinforcements. But if they did, The force-using knights would be overwhelmed, and the city itself would fall into chaos. Patrick rejected the idea and ordered that they send an envoy first to seek peace, silencing everyone. He then reminded them that even though the royal family's authority was weaker than before, Tesron's side had declared war without the royal family's permission, meaning they had planned this from the start. He questioned whether those who spoke of peace had even thought this through, then declared war and said he would not tolerate dissent. He announced that his sons would go to war as well, since Ronian's force had awakened and Logan was of age. Some around them murmured about Logan's night training. Rick listened, uneasy because Logan was away. Deciding the news had to reach him quickly, Rick sent a man to inform him. When the messenger arrived, Logan thought back to his past life and recalled that this war was not supposed to start for another 2 months. He wondered what had caused the War of the Fiefs to erupt early. The man urged him to hurry, explaining that Tesron's troops were already on the move, defying all custom, and that if Logan left now, he could arrive in the middle of the fighting. Logan knew there was no time to think. Kaislan reminded him that the mercenary corps was ready anytime. Seeing Logan unfazed, Kaislan remarked that for them, if there was no war, they would start one, since they had their hands on a great weapon. Logan noticed their confidence and found it reasonable. They had slaughtered a monster horde larger than usual last winter. In the end, nothing mattered except winning, and they already had enough combat power. The McLean household was tense with the sudden war, but all 314 members were convinced of victory. On command, they prepared to depart. The war began sooner than expected. The day after the declaration, Tesron's troops arrived at the McLean estate, their numbers exceeding the vassals' expectations. Henkel reported to Patrick that there were over 100 knights, about 1,000 regular troops, and nearly 10,000 conscripts. It was an all-out war. Patrick was stunned, thinking Tesron had lost his mind. Using conscripts in a domestic feud rather than a national war was unthinkable. He wondered why Tesron was going so far. Then came worse news. The House of Kairos would not be sending troops. Marion was shocked and shouted that it had to be a mistake, trembling in embarrassment before the men. Patrick ordered that every man able to carry a weapon be gathered. Henkel bowed in acknowledgement. Patrick realized their trusted Kairos allies had turned their backs on them. With no choice, McLean rallied what they could: 53 knights, 552 regular troops, and 4,418 conscripts, for a total of 5,023, less than half the size of Tesron's force. On the battlefield, some gossiped that Logan had run away since he was nowhere to be seen. Ronian overheard and angrily denied it, saying Logan would never do such a thing. He remembered when Logan had told him they would save their family together and that he would teach him a secret technique soon. Still, the rumor spread among the knights. Patrick told Ronian to take his brother's place like he's the new meat shield, and Ronian agreed. Patrick himself did not believe Logan had run away, but there was no time to dwell on it. He ordered everyone to charge and crush the enemy. Tesron grinned, seeing that Patrick had finally drawn his sword, and told his knights to face him. Patrick charged his sword with force, breaking through the vanguard, but his strike was dodged, the enemy knight blocking with his shield. Patrick was left momentarily surprised. Rick was on the battlefield, watching others get beaten down in front of him. Fear sank in as he realized how bad the situation was. They were so disadvantaged in this war that even a servant like him had been sent out to fight. If the enemy closed in, they would lose. Trembling, he took a hit from a Tesron soldier but managed to dodge the follow-up when an ally cut the enemy down and told him to get up and ready his spear. While the dude, who had already peed his pants, thanked him before he could recover, an enemy knight moved to finish him, and blood splattered across Rick's face as someone else took the blow. That was enough for him to decide he needed to get to the rear, as far from the enemy as possible. But when he turned to run, a soldier charged toward him, and Rick saw they had been surrounded from behind as well. The thought hit him that they were all going to die here. Patrick was still locked in combat with a knight blocking his strikes. The knight commented that the Tesron name lived up to its reputation, saying they had made thorough preparations. Patrick realized his opponent was withstanding attacks infused with force, and that Tesron had a high-ranking knight. He spotted at least 4 more who were of intermediate rank. He wondered about their confidence and concluded that they must be the ones assigned to deal with him. One of the knights grinned and asked how he liked it. Patrick understood that if he were held here, the McLean knights would be blocked as well, which would be disastrous. Determined not to let that happen, he picked up his sword and charged at the high-ranking knight, only to be attacked from behind. He barely managed to block it, surrounded by strikes from every direction. He accused them of having no honor as knights. They grinned, recognizing this as his final struggle before death, and decided to let him fight it out. Patrick once again charged his sword with full force and swung at his opponent, but in the same moment, a spear pierced his back, leaving him wounded and shaking. It was a trap, and the enemy had even taken the rear. He thought Logan had done well to run away and hoped his son could at least carry on the family's legacy. From a distance, Tesron watched Patrick's battle with the knights, satisfied that he had kept his high-ranking knight a secret until now. All he needed was to crush Patrick and take the McLean castle, and victory would be his. Then he heard the sound of cavalry from behind. Moments later, one of his men reported that a unit of about 300 cavalry had been spotted in the rear. Tesron wondered if McLean had more elite troops, but the man explained they carried no spears, only small weapons like crossbows. Tesron laughed, dismissing them as hunters' tools, and ordered his rear soldiers and archers to wipe them out, calling them trash, not elites. His man agreed, but before they could act, an arrow tore through a soldier's head, leaving Tesron stunned. Logan had arrived on the battlefield, visibly furious at what he saw. He gave the order to his mercenaries, and a rain of arrows fell on Tesron's army. The arrows from Logan's troops tore through the Tesron army in seconds, cutting soldiers down where they stood. Those who managed to raise their shields survived, but anyone unprepared fell instantly. Tesron's men tried to return fire, but their arrows couldn't even reach Logan's position. The mercenaries lost another volley, dropping even more enemy soldiers. Tesron couldn't believe what he was seeing. In moments, the rear lines had descended into chaos, and it wasn't even because of magic, just those cursed crossbows. He wondered how Patrick had managed to create such a weapon. Furious, he ordered the cavalry from the front lines to fall back and catch those pests. The cavalry rushed toward Logan's troops, but Logan was already grinning at the sight of them charging right into his range. Meanwhile, Ronian was locked in a fight with a knight, dodging blow after blow while the knight mocked him. Another knight ran up, scolding his comrade for wasting time while the battle was shifting in strange ways. As they argued, Ronian realized this was nothing like sparring. This was a real battle. He was still just a newly awakened fighter, but he couldn't lose. Remembering his father's words to act in his brother's place, he decided he couldn't crumble here. Spotting the knight's exposed backs, he took the chance, raised his sword, and struck. To his surprise, the slash landed easily, and then he noticed the arrows lodged in the knight's chest. Looking up, he saw Logan and felt a rush of relief. But before he could celebrate, cavalry stormed in from behind him, aiming straight for the crossbowmen. Logan noted the kite shield formation they were using and admitted it was an impressive defense. Then, with a sly smile, he gave an unexpected order for his troops to aim at the ground. Mercenaries hesitated, but Logan's grin widened as he told them to target the horses instead. They understood instantly, wearing the same unsettling smile. A rain of arrows fell, taking out the cavalry mounts and sending their riders crashing to the dirt. Logan was relieved he had arrived in time to help Ronian, but his father was still in danger. Winning the battle meant nothing if he lost his family. He handed command to Kaisalan, who was baffled since they had planned to keep attacking from outside enemy range. Kaisalan, sensing victory was close, couldn't understand why Logan would risk himself like this. Even if Logan was stronger, running into an intermediate rank knight could be fatal. Still, he ordered the troops to cover Logan's advance. Patrick was barely holding on against the high-ranking knights. One of them taunted him for charging in despite knowing he'd be stabbed. Patrick dodged their strikes, leapt back, and kept his distance, trying to read their movements. Something felt off. The knight seemed almost desperate despite holding the upper hand. He parried another set of spears when, in the next instant, Logan appeared in front of him, cutting down two knights in a single motion. It happened so fast, Patrick didn't even register what had occurred until he saw his son standing there. Logan muttered that he had barely made it in time, while the knights lay on the ground, coughing and defeated. As Logan rose from the ashes to reclaim the McLean family's glory, his father opened his mouth wide, staring at his son in surprise. The Lord slowly approached Logan. Tears rose in his eyes. He thought he had seen him coming from the enemy's rear with a squad of mercenaries, yet he had been sure he was far from here. Turning about, he wondered how he had managed to make such a journey through foes to reach him. Then he spun in alarm. He saw many warriors lying dead on the ground and wondered if they were all defeated. Taking a step, he asked when he had become so strong, but it did not matter now. He still did not understand what was happening. Opening his mouth, he added that since he was already here, it meant the advantage was theirs. Logan, staring forward, replied that naturally it was so. The Lord set his hand on his shoulder, saying it was clear to him. Lowering his head, he continued that his son had done well. The high-ranking one, glaring ahead, marveled that he had casually destroyed two mid-ranked knights at the same time. Looking at Logan, he kept thinking that this pathetic 20-year-old boy. Clutching his blade, he remembered that at that age he had worked himself to death to become a knight. Grinding his teeth, he decided he did not care. Why did the brat take a stance, thinking he could kill him here and now? Looking toward his men, he shouted for his allies to drink their potions quickly. The Lord, staring menacingly ahead, judged that from that strike and the assault it was enough to see that his son, though a low-ranking knight, Glancing aside, he kept thinking, would have the strength to handle most of the average ranks if he faced those of mid-level, and he himself would take on the high-ranking one. Suddenly, Logan extended his hand. Staring ahead, he declared he would fight him. His father, surprised, answered no, he was too strong for him. His son had advanced greatly but had not yet reached a high rank. The protagonist punched his father in the stomach. He went pale, staring ahead in fear. Then he dropped to his knees and Logan, reaching a hand to him, and basically roasted him. "Bruh, if I can fold you like a cheap lawn chair, let me fight instead." Father frowned and the Lord lowered his head. Then rising, he replied that the nod was given, but to be careful. They stood back to back. Logan, closing his eyes, smiled, saying they needed to finish this quickly. Then he dashed forward. The knight, watching his foe, thought that the Lord's son was advancing on him. He clenched his teeth. He thrust out his blade, wreathing himself in aura. Glaring ahead, he shouted, "How dare he!" Logan pushed off the ground. He closed on his foe with speed. A second later, he sheathed his weapon in aura. He lunged with all his might. Leaping, he swung his blade. Then he smashed into the high-ranking knight with full force. The man fearfully braced and caught the blow. Logan stared menacingly ahead. The knight managed to shove him back. Frightened, raising his head, he shouted, "How was this possible?" Though he was injured, he felt no outstanding strength or lofty level from him. Looking at Logan, he thought that the current was still pressing him. It meant he was going all out. A second later, he smiled wickedly. He kicked off the ground. He leveled his blade, thinking it could not be otherwise. He raised his sword to strike, yelling for him to die. Logan calmly held his blade before him. The knight made a few feints and struck the protagonist. His legs rooted to the ground. Logan easily blocked the blow. A heartbeat later, the knight felt a sharp pain in his gut. His pupils washed white, and he wondered if not for his wound. The protagonist fixed his eyes forward. Then he hit the foe with all his strength. The knight clenched his teeth in pain and jumped back. He stared at Logan in silence for a few breaths, clutching his shoulder, thinking he had never overextended himself. He needed to wait for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, he looked ahead in surprise. Then he grinned widely. Staring at the protagonist, he thought he had another option. The protagonist glanced down in surprise. Studying his blade, he thought the power lay in his sword. He clenched his teeth in displeasure. He watched his foe absorb his aura. The knight smiled, thinking all was well. He had fooled him. Then he fell back into stance. He thrust his dagger forward and, laughing, rushed back into the fray. The protagonist clenched his teeth in alarm. He drove his blade forward, and the knight, smirking, thought his center of gravity had shifted. He swung his sword. Then he closed in on Logan, preparing to strike, thinking it was the perfect moment. He lunged. Suddenly, he halted in shock. Glancing down, he realized he had only caught a shred of cloth. Logan stepped in. He watched the knight look around in confusion. Then, parting his lips, he asked if he was really that slow. Suddenly, the protagonist lowered his head and said he was using the secret of the divine sword. His blade shone brighter than before, and the knight stepped back, shouting that he needed to escape at once. Logan frowned and used the first form. He carved forward with all his might, sending a cleaving wave. The knight stared ahead in despair, yelling that it was impossible. A bright pillar of flame engulfed the protagonist's foe. The Lord turned in shock. Logan's younger brother also turned his head. They saw a blazing light at the heart of the battle. Logan spat to the side. A small crater yawned before him. The protagonist tilted his head. Staring at the fallen enemy, he said that a high-ranking knight had relied on cheap dollar store tricks. Then he lifted his blade. Opening his mouth wide, he shouted that he had killed the enemy general. The soldiers stared at him in astonishment. The spearman cried out in fear that a high-ranking knight had fallen. His comrade answered that it could not be. Their flag slipped to the ground, and someone shouted, "Where was the Baron?" Had they really reached him? Someone dropped his sword. The knight glared at his comrade, shouting that he had gone mad. He answered that they needed to surrender to save themselves. He did not want to die here. The spearmen, watching them argue, turned pale. Then the knights began to lay down their arms, saying they were surrendering. The lad, mouth agape, shouted that it was all thanks to the young master. Blushing, he added that they should honor the young master. The warriors smiled and looked at each other. They raised their weapons, calling the protagonist's name that even a guy like him could pull a dramatic kill. The moon climbed into the sky. A horse galloped ahead. The Baron, clenching his teeth in discontent, wondered at what moment everything went wrong. He had prepared for this battle for 3 years, even begged aid from other nobles and gathered 100 knights. Staring forward with displeasure, he thought that his cavalry and gear had doomed everything. Sweat beaded his face, and he remembered the Lord's eldest son. Tugging the reins, he decided first to return to his seat of power. Nearing the castle, he thought that this way he would live. Then he leapt from his horse. Striding to the guard, he shouted for them to open the gates. One soldier saluted. Then he pointed ahead in shock, shouting that someone was coming. A cavalry unit stood before them. The protagonist stared menacingly ahead. The Baron turned around in fear. Waving his hand, Logan shouted that Tesron was running fast. The protagonist stood beside his horse. Frowning, he began shouting that Tesron had lost. The warriors should open the gates and let the victor through. His gaze fell on the archers on the wall. The dumbfounded soldiers murmured that they had lost, and that was why the Viscount had returned in such a rush. The enraged man asked if they had chickened out after hearing the enemy's babble. Logan moved toward the wall. A yellow aura wrapped him. The guards stared and asked what he was doing. The protagonist readied a powerful dash. He suddenly sprang up. The guard looked up and wondered if Logan had vanished. The protagonist landed atop the wall. His blade hovered at the man's throat. With a hard expression, the protagonist ordered the gates opened if they did not want to die. The doors to the room stood open. Man stood before the table. The Viscount knelt. He was stunned, thinking he should at least take some gold. Tesron, terrified, heard that he had been caught. Turning, the man asked how he had gotten there. Logan recalled passing a girl and said his maid had shown him the way before he had even had to threaten her. The protagonist smirked and noted that such conduct spoke volumes about his reputation there. Tesron scowled at what he heard. The old man stood behind the protagonist. He began to edge away. Enraged, Tesron wondered how they dared betray him. Trying to crawl back, he cried out that he surrendered. At this point, he looked less like a lord and more like a kid. The man extended his hand and said he was ready to pay reparations and a share in line with the Convention on Feudal Wars. Logan asked again about compliance with the convention, wearing a satisfied look. Frowning, the protagonist said that Tesron had declared war without cause and invaded the next day, and now he was citing the convention. The man was horrified by what he heard. A vein about going to pop out on Logan's brow in anger, and he asked if Tesron had any conscience at all. The man lay on the floor and shouted that the protagonist still had the honor of an aristocrat. Prisoners taken in feudal wars are guaranteed mercy under the convention. Closing his eyes, Logan replied that he honored the dignity and traditions of House McClan, so he would spare his life and also allow time and permission to take the gold and depart. Looking at the satisfied Tesron, the protagonist noted that his father would say as much. Gripped the blade and added that Patrick was a man of honor to the core and would spare the surrendered man without conditions. Logan shifted his gaze. He noticed the chest with gems and a blade. Taking hold of the sword, the protagonist said it was beautiful. Looking at the protagonist, Tesron permitted him to take the blade, noting it was forged by the finest craftsman in the kingdom. Unsheathing the blade, Logan refused the dagger. Logan handed the blade to Tesron and asked him to take it with him. A smile crept over his face. The protagonist drove the dagger into the Viscount's chest. The stunned man began to cough blood. The protagonist, with a calm face, said, "That's what my noble father would do, but I'm the mafia boss," and grinned evilly that honor doesn't pay the bills. Sitting before him, Logan asked if he grasped how many had died because of him. The youth shrouded in a red aura said the man's wretched life would end here. Tears began to flow from Tesron's eyes. His gaze went empty. Logan calmly watched his death. Looking at Tesron's corpse, the protagonist told him to thank God for a swift end. The protagonist looked at his bloody hand. He clenched it into a fist. Smiling, Logan stated they had finally weathered the calamity. Rising to his feet, he noted it was time to finish this. The protagonist raised his hands before his face. He tightened his lips. Standing in the room, Logan began shouting that Tesron had taken his own life. Gusts of wind wrapped the castle. The guy ran to the protagonist in the room. Standing before the protagonist, he suggested they should look into the underground dungeon beneath the castle. Logan started to leave and agreed. A few days later, the protagonist was gazing at the evening sky. Patrick stood before his son on the fortress wall and asked what Logan was saying, noting that he had reached Tesron's castle as soon as he recovered. He asked with a grave look if the Viscount had committed suicide. Standing before him, the imperturbable protagonist suggested that Tesron must have been in despair. Holding his chin, Patrick asked if Logan had killed him. He began to study his son's tense face. Closing his eyes, the protagonist admitted he had done it on purpose. Stretching out his hand, he said they had to take his lands back under their control. He did not want his lion to live and cause them trouble in the future. Patrick's face was solemn. Closing his eyes, he replied that he agreed with this choice because the protagonist was already an adult and had his own reasons. Logan calmly thought that his father had changed. Placing his hand on the wall, Patrick turned to his son. Glancing around, he stated he had played a vital role in this battle. Without turning back, he quietly thanked him. A smile touched Logan's face. The embarrassed father brought his fist to his mouth. He turned to face the protagonist. Standing before him, he announced that he would become the official heir to House McClan. The surprised protagonist turned to his father. A smile was on the man's face. The protagonist lowered his gaze. He said with a satisfied look that he apologized since he had to refuse. The dumbfounded Patrick clarified if Logan was refusing the offer to become his successor. Looking at his son, he asked if the protagonist was worried about his reputation, adding that if so, his contribution to the battle had completely changed it. to which he received the answer that it was not about that. Placing his hand on his chest, Logan said that the McLeans are a family of knights. Ran is better suited for this role. Patrick listened with a serious expression as Rainian began using the Force at 14, 5 years before him. An image of his younger brother rose in the protagonist's mind. Frowning, Logan said it was impossible to predict what feats he would achieve when he reached his age. Patrick looked at him silently. Seeing his son's troubled expression, the man replied that he was right, but the head of the house was not chosen for combat achievements. Smiling, Logan thought that perhaps, judging by what was known today. But if Ran, as in his past life, were to earn the title of youngest user of the Force, there would be no more problems. The protagonist pictured Rainian as in his past life. A bead of sweat ran down the protagonist's face as he thought that, more importantly, becoming the heir would not give him any advantage. He did not have time to learn to be a baron. Logan stood quietly and stated that, as an elder brother, he wanted to give his younger brother a chance. He hoped that Patrick would wait until Rainian reached the right age. The man was delighted to hear this. He lowered his head and said he did not expect the protagonist to be so considerate of Rainian, adding that he would accept his request and postpone the choice of heir for 5 years when the youngest son becomes an adult. Logan thanked his father with a satisfied look for this. Standing opposite, Patrick emphasized that the protagonist would receive another reward. When they returned home, they would tally their income from the war. It would most likely exceed 100,000 gold. Placing his hand on his chest, Logan asked for permission to choose the reward himself. The warriors shouted loudly for the gates to be opened. Patrick, with his sons and the army, returned home. Boys with an eager look discussed that the warriors came back a week later and heard that the war lasted 1 day. One boy extended his hand and asked if his comrade had heard it was all thanks to the first young master Logan. They looked at the protagonist. The other pointed a finger and said that, according to the soldiers who had returned, the young master's mercenaries had turned the tide of battle. Boys turned around and listened as if they had known in advance, and he had heard they had defeated them with a mysterious weapon. He had even managed to deal with a high-ranking knight on his own. The dumbfounded girl asked if the first young master was such a great man, and she was told that everyone had thought he was nothing but trouble. The boys stood in a circle and discussed whether it was possible that Logan had brought so much monster meat for a reason. They happily declared that this was to be expected. Geniuses were different from ordinary people. The protagonist heard their chatter. Looking away, he thought it was embarrassing to hear such things. Ran rode behind him and asked what he would say, noting that everyone was praising him, to which he received the answer that it only made him blush. He shouldn't overdo it either. The younger brother asked with a satisfied look what else could he do if it was true, noting that they were happy to see him. They needed to smile. The confused protagonist asked about the smile. His gaze fell on the kids waving at him. The dude tried, and what came out was less smile and more serial killer about to ask if you live alone. The boys were startled by what they saw. The dumbfounded protagonist heard them whisper that they didn't know what to make of that smile and that he would cut off their heads with a finger. Holding the back of his head, the protagonist wondered what was going on. Patrick was watching him. He cried out with satisfaction for the villagers to welcome the victors of this war. The night sky blanketed the castle. The protagonist walked along the city street. Looking down, he asked if the welcoming would last until morning, noting that for people who had just returned from war, they had good stamina. Logan stopped when he heard his stepmom Marion shout, asking what he was planning. Ran tried to stop her. Furious woman asked if the protagonist had refused to become the heir and what his plan was, noting that he could fool others but not her. Disappointed, Ran apologized, adding that she was very upset by the trouble with the family. Smiling, the protagonist replied that everything was fine. Logan stood quietly before Marion. Looking at her, the protagonist reasoned that she had always been displeased with him. But after betraying Kairos, she had lost all her power, so he no longer had to fear her. Lowering his head, the protagonist concluded that if he apologized now, she might accept it. Logan looked at her. Standing before her, the boy said he realized that his conduct over the past months was unreliable, and he regretted being driven by envy and inferiority. Ran held Marion's hand and asked her to stop condemning him. Logan looked at his younger brother and declared that he was the one he should apologize to. The boy was stunned by what he heard. Gazing at the sky, the protagonist said that he had apologized to him upon returning, but never said for what. Frowning, the protagonist suggested that the remorse and the cowardice he had nurtured for years were hard to overcome. He looked down and noted that he knew this himself. Rainian flinched when he heard Logan apologize for hating him all these years. A bead of sweat slid down his face. Shocked, Marion listened as the protagonist said he had tried to mask his own incompetence with hatred. Logan calmly stated that he truly regretted his behavior now. Looking at Ran, the protagonist asked to be allowed to offer him a formal apology at least now. Bowing his head, the protagonist stressed that he was genuinely sorry. Ran stared at him in silence. Saddened, Logan thought that good deeds cannot erase bad ones. Clenching his hand into a fist, the protagonist concluded that he was still unworthy. The protagonist was surprised by the boy's words that everything was fine. He looked at him. A faint smile was on Rainian's face. Placing his hand to his chest, the boy said he believed that as long as he treated him well, the brother he knew would return one day. Blissfully, Rand closed his eyes. Logan, looking relieved, thought he had been foolish not to dare this sooner. Turning his gaze to Marion, the protagonist addressed her. He recalled helping his brother learn to handle a blade and said that he sincerely cared for Rainian. He patted his brother's head and said he hoped he would be the heir. Frowning slightly, the protagonist added that he understood he could not ask for trust right away, so she should watch everything he did from now on. Marion lowered her head. The protagonist looked at her. He smiled quietly. The moon shone bright in the sky while the protagonist reasoned that this would suffice for now. Morning broke. Logan and Hammer were moving through the forest. The disgruntled dwarf asked where the master was heading right after returning from the war, and he was told that he had rested enough and it was time to work. Frowning, Hammer replied that he was only worried, that was all. Turning back, the protagonist asked him not to worry because he would definitely like it. Sighing, the man thought that Logan did not know what he liked. The protagonist halted abruptly. He lifted his gaze. Staring at the huge mountain, the youth said that from now on they would be developing this mine. Bewildered, Patrick asked if Logan wanted the right to develop the mine as his reward. Spreading his hands, he asked if the protagonist meant the one in the mountain near the borders of Tesron, to which he got the answer that it was. Raising his hand, the man stressed that although it was a mountain, there was actually nothing there, and then asked why he had chosen it. Sunlight fell over Logan's face. Looking at the mountain, the protagonist said that hidden gold could be found inside it. Cart rolled through the woods, and the narration told us that the reason the Tesron house began the feud war became clear only a year after it ended. Tesron extracted gold from a mountain in the seized McLean territory, and this alone made him far more influential than any ordinary duke, until Rainian destroyed his family in revenge. Logan recalled his brother standing over a terrified Tesron. Rainian drew his blade. The youths walked down the corridor. The boy turned back and said there was an underground prison in Tesron's castle. Strange people were inside it, so he decided Logan should see for himself. The main character looked at the old man. The man, dumbfounded, cried out that they had done nothing wrong. Gripping the bars, he said they had simply mined gold from the pit they were hired for, and that the wicked Viscount had locked them there. The protagonist covered his face with his hand, drooling like a gold digger. He could not believe he had jailed 5 valuable mining experts. Man just handed me a whole Minecraft speedrun team. The bewildered old man wondered what was happening. A ship sailed on the sea, and the protagonist told us they had won the war against Tesron, but it was like riding a small wave. The ship headed toward an abyss, while Logan said that if the Empire's invasion, which led to the country's collapse, was the last obstacle, then the event to occur in a year would mark the beginning of the nation's death. Tentacles rose from the water. Tentacles started crawling onto the ship. The Kraken began to drag the vessel down. An image of the ruler formed in the protagonist's mind, and he added, "The death of the current Richard." After introducing various powerful figures, the protagonist stressed that Richard's sudden death would trigger a struggle between the 3 princes for the crown, followed by 3 years of civil war that would badly weaken the kingdom's fighting force, with the Empire invading just as the realm's strength had not yet recovered. Scanning the treetops, Logan wondered if this was what led to the kingdom's fall in the first place. Folding his arms, the protagonist reasoned that House McClan was not tied to any faction, keeping neutral, which would let them remain mere observers. Frowning, the protagonist stressed that he could not pass up such a chance. He pictured himself before heavily armored men and concluded that he would use the turmoil to reclaim the lands that had once been theirs, and they would again become rulers of the Southwest. Stroking his chin, Logan added that if he could, he would halt the civil war and move on. The protagonist was startled when a voice addressed him. Hammer stood before him and asked what he was daydreaming about in broad daylight. The man glanced at the mine workers. Logan noticed them and thought he had missed them. He needed to pull himself together because he had just survived a disaster. For the future's sake, he needed to raise his combat power quickly. But now, that suggestion sounded like nonsense. Frowning, the protagonist stressed that he would have to rely only on his own funds. He lifted his head with a smile on his face. Gazing at the mountain, the protagonist thought it would become a cash cow to bankroll his plans and told them that there was gold inside the mountain. He wanted them to develop the mine like it was a no big deal. Folding his arms, Logan asked how much it would cost him, roughly. Hammer stood before the workers with a grave look. He thought, puzzled, that this was another absurd job. The old man raised his hand and wondered if Logan was telling the truth, noting that Tesron had promised a fat paycheck, so he agreed right away, and then asked if he was sure there was gold there. Sighing, the protagonist answered that he was certain. The indignant protagonist stated that he had seen it with his own eyes. The baffled man wondered to himself how he had seen it. Pointing at his subordinates, the protagonist said that, for their information, this assignment was secret, so they would have to work in six. The puzzled old man cried out that working in six was an outrageous amount of labor. He turned to Hammer and added that even with a dwarf it was hard. The exasperated man silently begged the dwarf to back him. Hammer looked at him in silence. Looking aside, the dwarf said they could do it, but just prepare their funeral outfit in advance, sleep less, ditch their wife, and kiss their social life goodbye. The dumbfounded old man concluded that they were doomed. Smiling, Logan thought Hammer was a good fellow because he already thought like a worker. Scanning the mountain, the protagonist asked if they were ready to begin, adding that he would like to hear about payment. The old man held out his hand and said they needed to reach the gold first to gauge the scope of the work, but 5 million gold would be good as a down payment. Hammer said, face serious, that it would take a long time to develop the mine safely, with half a year just for preparation and another half year to run at full capacity. The protagonist looked down and reasoned that he knew it would take lots of money and time. But this gold had made the Viscount richer than other dukes, and he needed to get it at any cost. Logan looked up and thought that if he could just sell the monster meat now, he would invest the proceeds into the mine. Rubbing the back of his head, the protagonist stressed that the effects would only be known in half a year. Logan scratched his neck and wondered if he needed to wait, adding that if he removed the toxin from it, he could use it as a medicine right now. The protagonist lowered his head and thought that he had used a neutralizing agent for this when he was a mercenary, and he could do the same now if he did it himself and sold it. Logan clenched his fist in satisfaction. The scene jumps to a week later when sunlight fell on McLan's house in the south. Rick stood before the barrels and said it was the protagonist's cloudy medicine made from night grass, herbs from the plot, and other such herbs. Pointing at the servant, the protagonist told him not to call him Cloudy. It was a neutralizing agent. Rick gestured and said the monster meat was in the storeroom as requested. Logan then told him to come along to apply the agent to the meat. A startled Rick blurted out if the protagonist really wanted him to join. Clutching his head, the guy shouted that he didn't want to do it. The protagonist had never been there before, so he knew nothing. Annoyed, Logan wondered why Rick was suddenly squirming. He covered his nose with his hand. In front of the warehouse, the protagonist asked what that reek was. He'd expected a bad smell, but this was next level, like the meat had been marinated in gym socks. Yellow energy began to wrap his body. Eyes shut, Logan exhaled. The protagonist stepped inside and beckoned Rick to follow. Gazing upward, he said he dulled his sense of smell with power. If the guy felt sick, he should awaken his own. The protagonist handed over the powder and told him to dust the meat. Watching Rick, Logan added not to skimp. Every piece had to be coated. The black specks were toxic, so he had to be careful. Rick started chopping the meat into mince. The guy rolled the mince into balls. Holding one, the protagonist asked if it looked like medicine. At the table, Logan said they'd sell it. Rick would craft it, so he should remember the process. The guy shut his eyes when he heard the protagonist would pay him, so gold was stronger than Rick's nose. 100 coins could make even rotten monster meat smell like nothing. Producing the drug, the protagonist said they now had to test its effect. Rick then asked what it was for. The baffled guy heard it was for men's health and asked what that meant. Logan pictured a worn-out rabbit trying to crush something. A white hare hopped up and nudged him. There was a pill in his hand. The rabbit swallowed it. The beast started to crush far more fiercely. The rabbit's body swelled, huge and muscular. A loud cry rang out from the barn. Gripping his neck, Rick said it was now clear to him, then added there was one person he could test it on. Startled, the protagonist asked whom he meant. Rick pointed and said he meant Lord Dwayne. The protagonist pictured the man and wondered why his ears were burning. Knocking on the door, Dwayne told the first young gentleman it was him. The door opened a crack and he asked forgiveness. He was told he wished to see him. The man paced the room, calling the young gentleman and asking where he'd gone. Sneaking up behind, the protagonist said he'd been waiting. Leaping back to the wall, Dwayne cried out that he shouldn't pop out from behind so suddenly. The protagonist hugged him and said he just wanted to give a shoulder massage. He'd been very tired lately because he had to settle things after the war. The man replied he was fine. Unlike him, things were going worse for the Lord. Patting his back, the guy said he knew how hard it was for him. Frowning, Logan reported things were going badly for them because he'd spent every last coin on the war. The servants and knights didn't know and kept asking for their pay. Management was going through hard times. Dwayne burst into tears and called the young master. Wiping a tear, he said that all this time he'd seemingly perceived him wrongly, not expecting him to be so caring and even to think of the manager, and the protagonist asked if that was why he had problems in bed. The man dried his tears with a smile. He paced anxiously and asked to be forgiven. Extending his hand with the medicine, the protagonist said he wanted to give it to him. Smiling, the guy said it was a patented product from a merchant from Kalia, and the result was guaranteed after the first pill. He grinned, thinking he'd never actually tried it himself. The man looked sadly at the pill, wondering if he could break the bed every night and still wake up ready for round 2. Dwayne ran down the corridor. Logan stood beside the servants, thinking, finally. Rick held out a hand to the man, saying he was the manager, and asked how he could be racing down the hall. Frowning, Dwayne asked how much the pills cost. The protagonist smiled, deciding this was a success. The servant ground his teeth and asked if he could hear him. The man was sweating and smiling. He dropped to one knee. The manager looked at him sternly. Rick watched Dwayne kneel and asked what was happening. The protagonist frowned. The servant stared at him, shocked. Logan took out the box. Handing it to the man, he thought how after the first successful time, men bowed their heads before him and the experiments continued. The protagonist sat at the table before the night and said he'd heard rumors that he and his wife had been having many fights every night. Logan said that was enough and forcefully made Heinkel swallow the pill. A fire flared in his thoughts. The man stomped the floor and called the young master. Sitting behind him at the table, the protagonist told him to go to his wife. Smiling, he said he'd speak to his father himself. Heinkel looked at him happily and thanked him. The man walked through the office and asked permission to take his leave. Patrick turned away, telling his son what about it. Blushing, he went on to say that it was wonderful. The son's rays lit the door. Logan walked down the hallway and silently apologized to Ronan. Smiling, the protagonist informed they'd have another brother. Scowling, Rick demanded in anger why he hadn't offered him since he worked harder than everyone. The protagonist looked down at him like Rick is the one with no joystick down there. Rick, asking what that look meant. The boy watched him with alarm. Logan, back turned, said he had no one on whom to test the pill's effect. The protagonist looked at the windows and told him not to follow. He stank. Voice came from the magic ball, saying it was obvious that if the medicine worked, there would be demand. The protagonist sat at the table and said they should charge 100 gold each, 1,000 for a set of 10. Frowning, Philip in the ball asked if he thought the aristocrats in the capital were simpletons, so he shouldn't get in trouble. Raising his hand, Logan replied that of course not. He was simply confident in the product, and in his past life it had been bought so often the price had risen terribly. The boy handed a coin to the wizard, saying he should let him talk for another 10 minutes, and said that was logical if he was sure of the effect. Philip, arms folded, listened to the protagonist's belief that the result would be excellent. It would be enough for someone famous to try a pill and state their opinion. It had to be someone who needed such a medicine, and he asked what aristocrat would spread the word that his impotence had passed. The protagonist grinned and said many ears always listen to nobles' conversations. Even if it is secret, rumors will still spread, and other buyers will swarm like bees to honey. Touching his chin, the guy said that in that case, gritting his teeth, Logan listened to him suggest going to a banquet in the capital, and clarified whether he was serious. Looking away, the protagonist thought he only went to celebrate victories when he was a mercenary. His family had no money for banquets. Philip in the ball extended his hand, saying it was the easiest place to establish connections. Although it would take time to advance his business, he'd have gone himself if he were not a commoner, because selling medicine at a banquet wouldn't be possible. Taken aback, the protagonist asked again to sell at a banquet. He sat in a chair, listening to him say not to claim he wanted to do that. His house would be shunned if he pulled something like that in high society. And he answered that it wouldn't happen if he was not the one selling. Logan looked at the magic ball and said he remembered what he told him about the informant in the capital. He should go to him and find out everything they might need. Smiling, the protagonist said he'd soon arrive in Grand. He would learn the details when they met. The guy sadly looked aside, thinking he had a bad feeling. The plot moves a week later when the protagonist got off his horse and said they had arrived. Philip stood behind him in the capital, telling him that he had indeed arrived. Taken aback, he asked how he'd managed to get permission, specifying he meant to sell the aphrodisiac. Turning around, Logan replied that of course he hadn't told him about it. The protagonist glanced at the cart and remarked that, though it was hard to bring 3,000 boxes without a servant, he smiled, thinking his father had agreed faster than expected, likely thanks to his success in the war. The man extended his hand and said that when he had first come, he hadn't had any attendants either, asking whether he thought it normal for a noble's son to travel like that. Looking aside, Logan replied that picking a route was tricky with servants around, not to mention they had their own duties. He lowered his gaze, thinking that, speaking of work, he'd piled Rick with a hefty task. The youth recalled the servant smiling and calling him young master, thinking he had done everything for him in both his past life and this one. Protagonist pictured Rick rubbing his neck and asking if he could return to his duties, whether he wanted him working on his day off. He imagined the boy turning away, saying that lately the servants claimed he smelled like rotten meat. No one even come near him. At this point, the only proposal he was getting was from flies. The protagonist thought he was truly grateful to him. He remembered the servant with bulging pockets, asking if he'd said he was a little short on pills. No way. Which meant he'd shake him and thrash him for everyone that fell out. Philip stood before him anxiously, wondering if the look on his face seemed familiar, if he was having a flashback. Logan clenched his fist in delight and said that, as a token of thanks to Rick for such work, he would name the medicine Emporic. The man stared in shock, thinking there was no doubt he was insane. Eyeing the coat rack, Philip said he must be tired after the long journey. It would be better to recover at the bar. The protagonist sat at a table in the room and asked whether he shouldn't avoid talking about aristocrats who had problems with it in a place thick with ears. Turning to him, the man said he had gone to the informant to learn what he'd asked for. The protagonist propped his cheek on his fist and listened to him say he was really going to pay 900 gold for each document. Smiling, Logan replied that he charged a lot, but he did solid work. Philip frowned, hearing that if he conveyed his words correctly, they would receive the information needed, and said he'd repeated everything to him word for word. He held up one finger and said that first, they needed the names of nobles married within the last 10 years but without children. The man raised 2 fingers, saying that second, the names of nobles who had remarried or kept mistresses. Philip leaned closer to add that third, the names of nobles who ate food that boosted stamina, and the protagonist replied that that was correct. Then everything would be fine. He had done an excellent job, not just with this task, but with all the ones he'd been given. The protagonist cupped his cheek, listening to how the real trouble had struck the day he heard the news of the war. He hadn't even realized how worried he'd been until he learned it ended that evening. Frowning, Logan heard that whenever he thought about the mountain of monster meat he'd have to handle, he lost all appetite. Who would buy it? The protagonist flicked a sheet of paper at his face and told him to stop rambling and read this. Frowning, he asked who on the list he thought would be their first client. Philip began to weep. The protagonist placed his hands on his thighs. The man pointed at the sheet and asked, "What about him?" Logan leaned toward him. Taken aback, he said it was the same. A chandelier gleamed in the hall. A girl smiled sweetly at her companion. A man stood surrounded by women. The Count turned as his name was called. Davis stared at him in fear. Hand to his chest, Logan said he begged his pardon. He was the eldest son of the McClan house from the southwestern district. The man bit his lip with laughter and said they had a new guest here. Welcome. The protagonist smiled as people murmured that it was tasteless. Where was he from? What sort of trendy southwestern clothes, looking like he robbed a village tailor? He thought about how he wore what Phillips wore were fashionable, strutted in looking like a discount clown, drew stares and whispers. The protagonist stood before the crowd, thinking he had no time to forge useless ties at a pointless banquet like this. His only target was the Earl. He watched the man clench his fist, thinking that despite being a key figure in safeguarding the kingdom of Grandia and marrying at 20, as a man he was pathetic and still childless. The boy stood before him, surprised when Philip had marked his name on the list, since he'd grown quite famous in his past life. Remembering the sorrowful man seated there, Logan thought that it was the Earl who had taken his own life because of his wife. The protagonist imagined the woman scowling and asking if he was done talking, picturing her pointing at her husband and insulting him. The protagonist pondered what had happened between them, the slight his wife had given him at the banquet. He remembered the dumbfounded deities, thinking it had driven him to suicide. Scowling, the man reflected on how reputation and other people's opinions mattered immensely to him. Logan placed a hand on his chest, thinking he met all 3 points he'd given the informant. This was the perfect first buyer of Emporic, and he said he had come to the capital on business, and having heard of his authority, decided to meet him in person. Smiling, the man replied that he said business, but Gran already had everything. Count posed before the girls, saying he believed that, since he had come from the outskirts, many of the capital's goods must have shocked him. Grinning, the protagonist said of course, but he was sure nothing like his item existed here. That was why he planned to sell it. Stepping closer to his interlocutor, the protagonist said a medicine that turns men into beasts in bed. No more 2-minute warriors, no more fake snoring wives this. Davis was startled. The man bit his lip in displeasure. Frowning, the Count shouted that the son of a noble selling bedroom upgrades. A girl covered her mouth and said it was a terrible shame. Grinning, Davis thought, how dare this provincial speak here? Now he'll bathe in humiliation alone. The man closed his eyes, thinking it could be read right off his face. How obvious. Smiling, Logan said that, as a courtesy, he had brought a gift for an influential figure in the capital and asked him to accept it. The protagonist held out a box, saying it was his product, an Emporic which would be sold for 100 gold coins. The Count looked surprised to hear he'd specially put 3 in as a gift for him. This wonderful medicine had no side effects. He could swear on his honor as an aristocrat. A tear slid down the Davis's cheek because deep down, he knew his wife had been reading novels instead of cuddling him. Few days later, the bell over the door rang. A man held out a paper and said his master had instructed him to purchase the drug Emporic. Here was his ID. Smiling, the protagonist replied that Davis had sent him, thinking he'd hit the bullseye. Philip bowed after him in the street and told him to come again. He walked to Logan's table and said, 10,000 gold for 10 boxes, not bad for the first sale. The protagonist's voice drifted from the back, saying they would earn even more. The rent for this tiny shop alone cost 10,000. As expected, this was the center of the capital. He had barely managed to negotiate the lease. Philip raised a finger and said they needed a proper venue. It would be more useful if people could come in and inspect the goods themselves. He looked glum and said he went to a banquet almost every day, sometimes twice. The protagonist extended his hand and replied that one client wasn't enough for him. The man grinned and said they needed to advertise the product to as many people as possible. A week later, the man was walking down the street. He looked down, thinking he couldn't believe it. The count had asked him to buy that medicine again. No healthy food had produced such an effect on him. The servant neared the crowd. Many people were lined up in front of the house. The man was taken aback, wondering why the line was so long. For a moment, he recognized these people. Looking at the men, he thought that was the manager of Viscount Talon, and that one the butler of Count Hamill. The servant lowered his hat, thinking this could spark needless rumors. He should quickly buy the medicine and go. Philip peeked from behind the door and shouted that they were terribly sorry. The men were taken aback to hear that, unfortunately, they had sold everything prepared for today. The man smiled and said he truly regretted it. Emporic was very popular, but supply was short, so they set a limit of 50 boxes per day. The man clutched his chest in fear and said that if he returned empty-handed, his master would kill him. The old man smiled and asked the servant what was happening. Let him go find out. Grinning, the protagonist thought that imposing a limit spurred buyers, and others seeing the crowd would also take interest. Everything was going according to plan. Philip pressed his hands to his cheeks, shouting that there were no more goods for today and asking them to come back tomorrow. Smiling, he said everything was sold out today. The stranger grabbed the bag upon hearing it had been sold. Scooping up the money, the man asked in a panic what number day in a row it was. Glancing at the door, Philip said this was amazing. Smiling, he added they had met their sales target daily for a month. Everything sold out right after opening, so they would be able to make 4.5 million a month. Fingering the coins on the table, the protagonist wondered who knew half the nobles out here can swing a sword but can't even swing it at home. Propping his cheek with a fist, the protagonist said they had tripled the price and people were still eager to pay more. Soon he would start worrying about the kingdom's future. He looked up at his cheerful friend. The guy smiled and loud laughter spilled from the house. Logan, smiling, choked his colleague playfully and said he'd done it. Well done. And Philip wheezed that he couldn't breathe, all thanks to his efforts. Grinning, the protagonist said great. Starting next month, he would receive a cut of the profits. The guy was stunned. Felix watched as Philip's shout came from the building, promising he would do his best. Unbeknownst to them, a man outside was watching in secret. The boys stared toward the door as shouting declared at least 10 tons of gold per year. The protagonist covered his mouth with his hand. He stood over the table and asked if they were serious. HAMAR on the magic ball reported that, judging by the miner's words, there was a strong chance gold nuggets lay in deeper layers. Logan clenched his fist in delight, thinking that 10 tons of gold, even by a rough count, meant 100 million gold, a jackpot. Man had basically hit the medieval Powerball without even buying a ticket. The man said through the ball that the cost of extraction was serious. 5 million gold would be needed, asking whether they had the means to pay. The protagonist pointed at himself and said to wait. His master would get all the money and workers needed in an instant. Frowning, HAMAR thought it would be better if he had treated them more gently, because clearly, this lunatic was about 2 brain cells away from selling their kidneys on eBay. Moonlight lit the city street. The protagonist descended the steps, thinking the initial cost to develop the mine would be about 5 million. If Emporic sales held, he could gather 4.5 million in a month. He closed his eyes happily, thinking 2 months of sales would earn a lot of money. Looking up, the guy figured he had about 700 boxes of Emporic left, so he should go home, ship more here, and then start developing the mine. Eyeing the building's silhouette, Logan wondered why he felt someone there, however faintly. The protagonist frowned. The protagonist rushed forward, wondering if they were thieves, and burst into the room, standing in the dark. Grabbing his sword, Logan wondered if they had left. No, there was only one way out. They were still here. A stranger slipped behind him. The protagonist glanced back, uneasy, then swung his sword and asked who was there. He held the sword out toward the street. The guy stood on the threshold, thinking no one was there, yet he clearly felt someone. Logan was taken aback. The protagonist turned with a grin. Spotting the cloaked man, he thought he was on the roof and the guy pushed off the ground. He surged upward in a fury. A man stood atop the house and Logan swung his sword. Felix dodged the strike. He looked at him in surprise. The two stood facing each other. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist demanded who he was. Felix frowned without a word. The protagonist watched as the foe vanished. The guy was stunned. He stood on the roof, thinking how no trace of his presence remained, though he'd been right there. Logan looked down. The protagonist picked up a scrap of cloth and, raising his hand, asked what kind of nonsense this was. Morning came. Taken aback, Philip asked if an aura user had slipped in. The guy sat at the table and replied it was only a guess, but at minimum he was an advanced force user. He crossed his arms and explained it wasn't merely that he sensed a high rank. The thief was clearly on another level. His friend lowered his gaze sadly and asked how an aura user could be a thief. With it, one could rise from slave to aristocrat. Would such a person stoop to robbery? Frowning, he asked what was taken. If it was medicine, Logan set the box on the table and said it was only 2 pills of emporic, that's all. Philip shook the medicine into his hand and said that just 2 meant he wasn't after the cash. He took it for himself. The protagonist was startled when he heard him ask if there were any incapacitated aura users. The protagonist raised a finger to check whether an aura user was on his list, and his colleague replied no. He'd been asked for an extra fee since it was extremely sensitive info, and he refused. Looking up, Philip said he recalled there was one person. The guy pictured a boy running joyfully and saying he was a childless aura user who lived in the capital. The man watched children running along the road and looked at them sadly. The woman looked at him and asked what he was staring at. Felix spread his hands and replied he was simply enjoying the street view. The husband looked away, troubled. The wife glanced at the happy family and again at the children, then pressed a hand to her chest in disappointment. Hearing her, he said no, he liked the cityscape and shouldn't allow himself foolish thoughts. Turning, the man said they should go home. The woman hugged him and said she was so happy to have met him. He knew. Felix looked at her sadly, hugged her tight, and replied he was glad too. Imagining the grinning knight, the protagonist thought of how he was the finest swordsman in the kingdom, with sadness and regret rooted in his heart. It all began with a simple wound he'd received in his youth. Fighting for his country, he was hurt in the groin, and being young, he paid it little mind. Just another honorable wound from doing his knightly duty. Felix gazed sadly at the sky, wondering what the title of Duke and the glory of the strongest on the continent even meant, frowning. He thought that without a child to inherit, all of it would fade into oblivion. He remembered sitting on the couch with his wife. Felix imagined her taking his hand, and the Duke pictured the girl looking at him and saying that for him this must be agony. He recalled his wife holding his braid and telling him that, if he didn't mind, she should let him stay beside her. He pictured her crying desperately. Felix thought how sad he was and wondered if there was any way to repay her for the boundless love he'd received. The man walked ahead of the servant in the street and asked why he had to come earlier when they were only pressuring him with talk of needing an heir. Lewis looked at him with sympathy. Walking behind, he said he would try to speak more carefully. A very effective medicine had recently appeared in the capital. The guy frowned. Felix turned and asked if it was true. Lewis followed, saying it apparently even healed physical injuries. Raising a hand, he added he didn't know if he believed it, but there were many claims of its effectiveness. Closing his eyes, the Duke thought he had already tried the medicine after stealing it. Felix stood there, troubled, thinking he never expected to commit robbery, even if his wife's tears gnawed at him. What a shame before all his students. Clenching his fist, he thought that, moreover, it had no effect. Gazing at the palace, the Duke said rumors should be treated with distrust. Felix walked down the street, thinking rumors are just rumors. Medicine cannot fix what aura didn't help, and it was time to give up. At the gate, the man cried that he'd already said it. The guard looked displeased and said he couldn't admit him without an appointment, asking how many times he had to repeat it. Smiling, the protagonist replied that this was why he'd asked him to simply relay his name. The protagonist grinned and said he would surely want to meet after hearing it. Taken aback, Philip asked if he was going to personally visit the Duke. He put his hands on the table and said he shouldn't tell anyone he planned to visit the strongest man in the kingdom and ask if he was the one who robbed him and how things were with his wife. The guy frowned and asked if he truly meant to do that. Philip glared and said he was courting trouble and should just pretend nothing had happened. Logan sat in the hallway, thinking that if anything went wrong, it would be bad for them. His colleague was right, but if that person really was the Duke, this was a chance he couldn't miss. The man opened the door to the room, extended a hand, and told him to come in. The protagonist stepped inside. Looking at Felix, who was turned away, the protagonist thought this was a chance to forge a strong bond with one of the strongest men in the kingdom. He bowed, saying he welcomed him and that he was the eldest son of the MCLANS house. The man frowned. Logan studied him, guessing he might be around 70 yet appeared far younger. Had he slowed his aging with a potent aura? Felix glanced over and remarked that the McLan's house lay in the southwestern region, asking why he had traveled so far from there. Smiling, the protagonist decided it was too early to dive into business and mentioned he had just opened a venture in the capital, so he had brought him a product as a gift. Setting the box on the table, he said it was a remarkable remedy for men's. Nobles swore it turned them into beasts in bed. The Duke looked down and asked if that was true. Smiling, the guy noted the lack of reaction. Now he wasn't sure he really was the thief, so he would try a different angle. Eyeing the box, he added that such a thing wouldn't suit a superhuman like him, but he had brought something more special. The man shivered at that. Logan smiled, pondering what had triggered him. He hadn't cared at first because the emporic hadn't worked on him. The protagonist pictured a medicine case, thinking the toxin in the monster meat used in the current batch had been neutralized for use as an aphrodisiac and to treat dysfunction. Imagining a heap of pills, he thought ordinary poison wouldn't affect a superhuman, so he had stockpiled it. He recalled the flying drop, thinking he had made a potent concentrate. He glanced at the box and said it was a limited edition of the emporic. Felix stared in surprise. Recalling how he had writhed in agony, Logan thought he'd called it limited because it packed the force of 50 normal pills, and he'd even tested it himself. Safe to say the effect would be killer pain. If a commoner without a power core took it, he'd die, but an aura user would not. Hand to his chest, he said that if he liked the pill's effect, please let him know and he would gladly send more. Felix accepted the box. He said nothing. But the silence spoke volumes, either becoming the strongest aura master alive or turning into the capital's first human washing machine in bed. The next day, sunlight poured over the building. Smiling, the Duke asked what he wanted and said he was ready to do whatever lay in his power. The protagonist tightened his fists in thought, so it worked, and said he didn't understand what they were discussing. He eyed the delighted man, thinking an aura master is a martial artist, a master of strength who uses life energy. Clearly, he appreciated the medicine's effect. It worked. Clenching his fist, Felix thought the medicine wasn't a one-off. After 30 uses, its effect would stack and he would be fully cured. His long-standing gloom and chest pain had met their end. He stood confidently before the youth, eyeing the smiling Logan. The Duke marveled that he had brought him such a gift and hadn't even mentioned his deed. Felix calmly recalled seeing his swordsmanship that day, very good for someone so young, so he believed him the owner of this miraculous remedy. Spreading his hands, the man said he seemed in a hurry, then looked at the serious youth and said that thanks to his gift he had a chance to be cured of a lingering illness and was ready to repay him. Let him name what he wanted. The protagonist calmly replied that, in that case, could he ask for a useful book on the art of swordsmanship? Felix reached to the top shelf and tipped out a book with a finger. Logan accepted it, surprised. Pointing, the man warned that the training inside would make his body ache, but it was worth reading since it had several eccentric points. The protagonist beamed at the book and asked if he could write a note confirming it was given to him. Grinning inwardly, he thought, great, he hit the jackpot. Then, abashed, he felt it was a shame to take only a book from the Duke. Though the man was ready to grant anything, his aim was entirely different, and he listened as the man said he still thought that was lacking. Eyes closed, Felix declared he would personally teach him sword techniques. The boy furrowed his brow in shock. Did the greatest swordsman in the kingdom want to teach him? The Duke stood calmly before him and said he understood his modesty and didn't need much, but it felt embarrassing to repay with only a book. Smiling, Logan mused that in this life it was the first time anyone had said such a thing about him. Even if he held the divine sword's secrets, there was no reason to refuse the strongest man in the kingdom, and he thanked him. They stood together outside, and the man said that judging the talent of remarkable young warriors was one of an old man's joys. Extending his sword, he told him to focus because he wouldn't yield. The protagonist drew the weapon. Frowning, the Duke commanded the blade be bared. The youth clenched his teeth in a panic. He stood before his opponent in flames, feeling a tremendous pressure bearing down on him. Reaching with a trembling hand, he thought he couldn't even grasp the hilt. Logan eyed the fierce man, concluding this was what an aura user was like. Felix confidently leveled his weapon. Grinning, the protagonist thought not all aura users could bind their whole body with such power, even if his rank was lower. But still, he frowned, since if that were true, battles across the continent would end with aura users mopping up the rest. In his view, it wasn't just raw strength. Seizing the glowing blade, he figured this must be some special ability. Felix regarded him gravely. Sweat beaded down the boy's cheeks and the mana cluster started to glow. Logan stood wreathed in fire, deciding to use the power to heighten his senses, not his body, then analyze what was holding him back. Eyes shut, he realized that whenever he tried to move, the Duke's force provoked it to trigger. Shifting his elbow aside, he felt it dispersing the energy he invested into motion. He panted, unsure how this was possible, yet grasping how to resist it. Clenching the weapon's grip, Logan wondered when he could suppress that force. He swung the sword, thinking he needed to react a little quicker. Felix frowned. Felix said with a sober gaze that it was just as he thought. The Duke watched the boy raise his sword and said he was gifted. The protagonist wiped his mouth with a fist. Lowering his blade to the ground, the man said, "Good, now watch closely." A red gleam bloomed at the tip. Logan saw mana envelop his teacher, realizing he was focusing the power that suppressed him onto the sword's point. Biting his lip, he wondered if this was the blade's aura, then looked up, alarmed, and decided it was not. Grinning, Felix said he would receive. The youth stared up in fear. Gazing at the immense flaming sword, Logan murmured that this was the power of the blade. Watching that massive edge, he reasoned the sword moved very slowly. He could see it, yet could not move. The protagonist scowled. Staring at the edge, Logan felt the Duke's power saturate his whole body, disrupting his senses. The red blade's force swelled, and he wondered what he could do. Even grasping the principle, sweat streamed down his face. Suddenly, he was startled. Logan formed a knot of energy at his heart and noted that his own power neutralized the Duke's. Watching Felix, he trusted his intuition, telling him he could not evade that strike. He frowned. A yellow aura spread over the ground beneath Logan. Startled, Felix asked if he had raised a power barrier. He swung his blade. Both men braced for a mighty clash. Felix stomped the earth and charged at him. A sphere of mana wrapped the protagonist. Fear twisted his face. Felix unleashed a crushing blow. The youth was hurled aside. The man observed him calmly, lowering his blade before the trembling protagonist. Raising his head, Logan began to speak of the aura blade. Scowling, Felix asked if he thought he'd teach him something he couldn't master. The protagonist smirked, saying he had seen the complete version. Felix regarded the fallen Logan and said that, near the end, he had unconsciously taken the bout a bit more seriously. With keen interest, he added he could hardly believe the youth had stood face to face with him. Some people were simply destined to succeed in this world. Gazing at the unconscious Logan, the Duke remarked that he would be fascinating to watch. The butler looked over and asked if he was leaving already. Standing before him, the butler added that the Duke had told him to rest until he was fully recovered and that he could remain there. In response, he heard that everything was fine. Thanks to the potion Felix had given him, he was fully healed. The old man stepped aside for Logan and asked to be allowed to escort him to the gate. The evening sky draped the garden. Turning back, the protagonist thanked the old man for seeing him off. The embittered protagonist began to depart at lightning speed. The old man turned and realized Logan had already gone. The protagonist slipped into an alley. Clutching his stomach, he noticed that it hurt a lot. Holding the potion, the protagonist stressed that he could not use such an expensive vial for these wounds. He still could not believe that Felix had given him a top-grade potion not available anywhere. He felt a sharp pain in his belly and thought that he had recently increased his strength, so he should be able to heal the injuries himself, though it would be hard since they were inflicted by the Duke. Gazing at the bottle, the protagonist concluded he had gained more than he had lost. Looking at the note, Logan read that these were the coordinates of the communication channel to Felix's estate. If he faced trouble while mastering the blade's power, he could reach out. Grinning, the protagonist wondered who would have thought his impression of him would be so favorable. The Duke had treated him almost like a pupil, and maintaining that connection would be very useful later. A guy peered into the alley and called to Logan. Philip, looking dumbfounded, said he had waited nearby for the protagonist to come out and asked why he was so pale. With a frightened face, he asked if the protagonist had been rude to the Duke, and received the reply that he had merely learned a bit of sword art from him. Logan suddenly coughed blood. Staring at the sky, Philip cried that he would prepare everything for an escape and find the fastest horse. A week later, the signboard saying the Emporic was sold out, and they should return later. Logan stated with a serious look that total income from Emporic sales was about 4,100,000 gold. Frowning, Philip said if sales stayed steady, then 4.5 million in a month would not be hard to earn. The two exchanged smiles. A loud, joyful shout rang from the house. Seeing Philip kneeling, the protagonist asked if he was so happy that he didn't mind skipping his bonus this month, and the guy begged him not to ruin this moment. He hasn't felt this alive since free samples day at the bakery. He looked at Logan and said he had established the process of purchasing monster meat in Kalia. With a puzzled look, he asked if the protagonist had considered buying a house in the capital, noting that given living expenses it could be profitable. Closing his eyes, the protagonist replied he did not want to, since he would be there for a year and a half at most. Until then they would focus on the Emporica, after which they would have to move even if they wished to stay. Getting to his feet, Philip asked him to take care of his health so the business could continue to flourish. His coughing blood had horrified him, and he received the answer that this was why the protagonist had spent an entire week locked in his room. Philip recalled how he entered his room and asked if he was truly focused on recovering, noting that whenever he came, he was always doing something at the table. Smiling, Logan thought he liked that Philip didn't pry further. In his place, Rick would definitely dig to the bottom of it. Standing opposite, the protagonist said he would be heading home, and Philip had to calm the customers until he sent a new batch of Emporic. He was surprised and said there was one more thing. Each month they needed to send food rations worth 100,000 gold to Tesron and McLean. Dumbfounded, Philip asked again. Closing his eyes, the protagonist noted they would do this for a year, so they had to find a supplier. The puzzled man said he had not known Logan valued his people so much. Approaching the door, the protagonist thought he was doing it because it was necessary. Holding the handle, the protagonist remarked that only in a year would the chronic shortage of food at the McLean's end. Looking down, Logan reasoned that even with the plains of Tesron, due to the McLean's infertile lands, they would still be in the red. Human labor plays a vital role in his plan, so he could not allow them to starve. Opening the door, the protagonist said he had work to do, so he would go. Exhausted people sat in the room, their faces gloomy. Studying the paper, the mysterious stranger said Logan wanted them to find these individuals by name and a few external traits. With a puzzled look, he asked if that meant the protagonist didn't know where they lived and whether they would have to search the whole continent. The protagonist, wearing a serious look, asked them to simply say whether they could manage it, noting he would pay handsomely. The guy looked over the list and agreed. Logan left the building. Walking down the corridor, the protagonist thought he knew it would be hard to find them since even the names he knew might be fake, but there was no other option. Looking up, the protagonist noted he had to gather all the independent superhumans at any cost. He pictured various warriors and added that they were the ones who, in their past lives, had reached such a level without joining any organization. Each of them would be of great help in the war against the Empire, especially the guy she had hired. The protagonist paused, sighing. Logan wondered why he was in such a rush, adding that he was too anxious even though things were going well in the capital. A slight smile appeared on his face. Looking at the sky, he told himself to calm down, there was still time. The man slammed his hand on the table. The stranger stood behind him and asked the elder to settle down. Puzzled, the guy stood behind and said he only came to convey his words. He was taken aback by the demand to explain why he had called his followers this time as well. Pointing, the boy explained they would be sent to the rural southwest, to the McLean's territory. A dark aura surged toward him. Dumbfounded, the boy added that it would be a 6-month mission. The man touched the stranger's shoulder and thought he could not allow that. With a stern look, he said it was time to settle the matter once and for all. The man was furious. Clouds drifted above the tall tower. Someone stepped toward the table. A hand reached for the sleeping boy as he was addressed. The dark-haired youth opened one eye. The man planted his hands on the table as he greeted someone, explaining that it was a long-range earth magic spell of the fourth circle. Sweat beaded on the boy's face as he wondered what the man had come for and how he had assumed he was an aristocrat, but his suit was too simple. The protagonist stared straight ahead and said he needed a couple of magic scrolls. The dark-haired youth smiled, thinking such a person would never come to meet a high-ranking mage and would probably buy a bunch of scrolls not much different from each other. Then the protagonist asked for 150 destruction magic scrolls. Logan slipped a hand under his clothes when he was asked again. He placed a parchment on the table, explaining it was his user certificate issued by Cooper Bank. The brunette examined the document closely and counted 6 zeros. The youth gaped when he realized it stated 4 million gold. The protagonist looked at him without emotion. The protagonist fixed his gaze and exclaimed that he would accompany him upstairs. Rocks were hurled at people as it was explained that destruction magic was a fourth circle, long-range earth spell, and depending on the mage's potential, it could even topple rock. However, due to drawbacks, like slow activation, obvious signs of use, and working only on rock and soil, it was not used in combat at all. 2 people stood near a huge mountain, talking about how it was shaking and how it must be destruction magic. Logan was shown in profile, thinking how it was perfect for construction, how he could speed up mind development and solve other issues at once. The protagonist looked warmly at the man before him, who asked if he truly wanted to buy 150 destruction scrolls, and he answered yes. The bearded old man folded his arms and laughed, saying they hadn't had such a generous customer in a long time, and that he had even begun to worry. It was then explained that this was William, head of the Earth's magic tower. The protagonist remembered the man running toward him and thought he never imagined he would come himself, and that he was the 5th-generation head of the tower. But he acted like that for 1.5 million, assuming things were going badly for them. The men were seated at the table when the young man realized his trading partner's weakness was an advantage for him, and he then said that his house of McLean's was a small-time thief in the southwest, and that he would understand if he had never heard of it. Basically admitting their dollar store nobility, so don't accept much. The interlocutor then laughed. William sat across from him, smirking, as he replied that it seemed they, in turn, had made a mistake, then asked for forgiveness, adding that he would issue a severe reprimand. The man sounded like a medieval HR manager handing out write-ups for bad vibes. Then Logan said that it wasn't necessary and that it was a trifle. Sweat poured down the brunette's face as he realized he was done for after the old man called the customer kind. The tower leader frowned, thinking how he had almost let this simpleton go to an intern, and how earth magic was used only for farming or planting crops and trees in peaceful times. The protagonist stared blankly ahead as the old man wondered what kind of aristocrat would spend costly scrolls on such trivial things when he could hire people, and then added that it was precisely such ignorant fools who babbled about the magic tower growing weaker after he became the tower leader. The bearded old man ground his teeth as he admitted he had indeed spent the budget for this month a bit early. William was shown in profile as he thought how great it was that this simpleton had come to them now, how he needed to butter him up and draw more money from him, and then said that, to be honest, there was one problem. The protagonist placed his hands on the table as he asked what it was, to which he replied that he must know it took at least a fifth circle mage to craft a fourth circle scroll. The old man's mouth fell open as he added that they didn't have many such specialists in their tower these days. Logan looked displeased as he asked what the issue was. William stared ahead, puzzled, thinking this wasn't the reaction he expected, and decided he should check once more. The protagonist rose, pushing his chair back, as the leader said the guy knew each scroll was expensive to make, so they couldn't produce them in advance. Then he was told it seemed nothing could be done. The old man sat behind the protagonist, who said that he had planned to buy 150 a month, and if they had trouble making that amount, he would simply contact the ruler's family's magic tower. William fell to the floor before the young man as he asked the master to wait, and then asked him again. Logan lowered his gaze as he answered in the affirmative, adding that he meant 150 every month, and that in 6 months he would ultimately need 900 scrolls. The old man covered his mouth with both hands. The air around the leader turned icy as the buyer said that, since it was already hard for him to make 150 now, they would not last 6 months, meaning he had miscalculated. William grabbed the boy's leg as he was leaving. Bro went from dignified archmage to please don't cancel the subscription. William's eyes widened as he said that fourth circle scrolls cost 10,000 gold each. The old man's gaze went wild as he said that 150 scrolls would cost 1.5 million. The tower leader frowned deeply, looking forward, as he shouted that the sum for half a year was 9 million. He clenched his fists, thrusting one to the side. William stared ahead with determination as he said that it was a very attractive price. The master's shoes gleamed as the old man asked how about finding a mage instead of buying scrolls, and he was asked again. The protagonist looked down thoughtfully, considering how detached mages hated dirty work, so they usually sold scrolls, but that he would lend him a mage who would cost even more, noting that the man had polished his shoes well. The protagonist looked away, thinking that a fourth circle mage would be as effective as 3 scrolls, and then asked if they had a fourth circle mage willing to go to a construction site in the countryside. Logan stood before the tower leader, who replied with a laugh that they had misunderstood each other, and that even he couldn't order a mage of that level, asking forgiveness. Then the guy wondered what he had hoped for. William bent his index finger as he explained that he could instead provide 9 second circle mages and 1/3 circle mage, and that they were apprentices who had worked as a team on various construction sites for a long time, asking what would happen if he reduced the number of scrolls in exchange. The protagonist looked at the man with boredom, thinking that sounded good, and that the construction had been going on a long time, so it would be even better. The protagonist was shown in profile as he wondered what kind of mages specialized in construction, deciding that he wanted to see what kind of people they were. The man in the long robe halted. The brunette stood before the other mages as he introduced himself, stated that he was a 3rd circle mage, and said they would be in the buyer's care. Logan looked ahead anxiously as he said his name, and the old man said that now they had greeted each other and could go. The mages had their backs to the boy as they asked for his forgiveness. The angry protagonist turned to the tower leader, exclaiming that they looked like sleep paralysis demons who haven't seen sunlight since the last dynasty. He replied that, regardless of their appearance, they were young employees with the most experience in the construction field, and that they were genuine experts. The young man recalled the sorcerers folding their hands before him, thinking they truly did seem reliable when he had superficially examined them with his senses, and that among them there were 2nd circle mages and one with the 3rd, and moreover they were 20 years old and already considered talented. The protagonist looked carefully ahead as he wondered why he had agreed to send his students to the countryside, deciding he wasn't telling the whole truth and whether it was worth checking him. Logan turned to the bearded old man as he said that, compared to 4th circle scrolls, The offer to cut their number and provide second circle magicians was not a fair exchange. Then he asked him again, answering that 10 magicians should be enough, and that among them there was one with the third circle. A smirk curled the guy's lips. Satisfied head of the tower stood before the protagonist and said that then, for 120 scrolls and 10 magicians, he would pay 1,200,000. William pursed his lips and closed his eyes. The protagonist, smiling and looking ahead, thought this was a damn low price considering the talent of those magicians, though he wouldn't mind if he agreed, and that no one would send normal magicians for such a price. Sweat beaded on Logan's face when the old man agreed. The head of the tower handed the buyer a document and offered to sign a contract. The protagonist looked at the parchment in fear, wondering if he had really agreed so seriously and in such a hurry, and when he had managed to prepare the contract, since the ink on it wasn't even dry, concluding that he knew something was wrong there. A man appeared behind the protagonist and told the head of the tower that he had heard everything and needed to speak with him at once. Clayton was being held by other mages, who asked him not to do this and to help them stop him. Then someone called him by name. Logan looked worried. The man bore a magic circle on his chest. When the boy realized he was level 5, he wondered if the leader wanted to send his followers away again. The bearded old man stood before Clayton as he answered that it was for the good of the tower and that his followers were the most talented. Then he explained that that was why he was asking why only they were doing the difficult work. The young mages looked one way as their mentor added that it wasn't someone else doing this, but children who had just returned from work. Then William said that any work was nothing to the young, and that it was for the good of the tower and themselves. The protagonist watched the quarrel as Clayton asked whether the old man thought he didn't know he had been oppressing them ever since he received the 5th circle and became an elder last year. Then the leader asked if he had gone mad and how he could act like that before their guests. The protagonist stared ahead indifferently as he realized what was going on. The bearded brunette was shown in profile as he thought how this man had reached the 5th circle at a relatively young age and become an elder, and the tower leader was afraid of that. William looked angry as the guy thought how he was taking it out on his followers because he couldn't confront the elder. Logan straightened when he realized that the internal conflict in the tower was convenient for him and that he couldn't believe he had landed such a lucrative contract. The old man crossed his arms as he said that if he didn't want to obey the tower leader's orders, then he didn't care and that he could leave with his followers. Then Clayton asked if he was serious. The dark-haired man gnashed his teeth. He clenched his fist. Clayton stood with his legs spread wide. William raised his forearms before him as he told the elder that if he wished to leave, then he ought to do so. A vivid carpet was revealed. The stone walls of the room trembled. Gri thrust out his hand while he cursed, shouting that things were bad and they needed to stop. Clayton opened his mouth wide as he told the tower leader to prepare. William gritted his teeth, staring ahead. The boy clenched the seal in his hand. He stood near the table when they looked at him. The mages watched the boy who took the document. Rick stared ahead in fear. The protagonist grinned creepily as he declared that the contract was now signed, looking less like a noble businessman. He stood before the sorcerers as he repeated himself. The protagonist shook his head as he asked the 10 mages to follow him and advised the 2 senior ones to sort it out themselves. Sweat beaded on the bearded men's faces as he asked if it was true that the contract would remain valid even if the head of the tower changed. William stood before his colleague as he said that they had shown their guests a worthless side of themselves and that he would send them the scrolls as soon as they were ready. And his interlocutor objected, saying he was not finished yet. The gray-haired elder pointed at Clayton as he asked him again whether he really wanted to break the contract with the Tower of Earth Magic, and then told him to know his place. The man clenched his fist as he agreed with him, answering that since he was acting like this, he would leave with his followers. The dark-haired mage put his hand on his chest, staring ahead. Logan and William looked in the same direction. They opened their mouths wide when the leader reminded him he was an elder too, asking how one could waste time in the countryside. Then the boy added that he had never hired a mage of the 5th circle. The protagonist bowed to Clayton, who said he would not ask for payment and would simply help his guys get the job done faster. Then the young man exclaimed that he was very grateful to him, and the old man asked him to wait, saying they had not finished their sentence. The young mages wiped away tears as the mentor asked only to postpone the trip for a day, since his followers needed to rest before leaving, to which the protagonist agreed, adding that in that case they would meet tomorrow at lunch at the western gate, and the leader asked if they could hear him at all. The carriage passed through the gate the next day. People stood by the corner of the wall as Logan thought about how yesterday's contract was an unexpected stroke of luck, and how hiring a level 5 mage would cost $1 million. The protagonist folded his arms, thinking how he wanted to get home quickly, and how he would send him to the store from there. The protagonist looked away intently when someone addressed the young master. The girl covered her face with a fan and said they had not seen each other for a long time, and he recognized her. Logan gaped, staring ahead, as he addressed her formally and thought she was rude as always after. He asked if they were close enough to call each other by their first names. Rena looked aside as she said rumors were going around the capital that a rather shameful business had opened there. Then she suggested that the MCLANS house had started having problems. She just rolled up and dropped a whole roast session. Logan's mouth widened in a smile as he replied that she knew how greedy he was about money, then asked her not to worry about anything, like thanks for the TED Talk, but nobody asked. The blonde girl was shown in profile as she said the amount of money she had given him was not small, and that it seemed difficult to recoup it if he lived in the barren lands. Logan had bags on his back as he replied that she was right, and that it was time for him to go, and he thought how disgusting she was, and that it was better to avoid her. Then Rena said she had heard about his great contribution during the feudal war and that he had used a special weapon. Carriage stood behind the protagonist as she added that she had an offer. The blonde looked aside coquettishly as she asked if he wanted to sell it to her. The protagonist opened his palm as he replied that it was not special at all and that he felt bad about refusing her, but he had to. Rena watched the running guy. She looked displeased. The young man took a step forward, thinking that even after he became known for selling emporic, none of the nobles showed interest in the feudal war. Logan imagined the blonde with the fan as he thought about her, and how her entire family was probably interested, and pretty quickly. The protagonist lowered his concentrated gaze as he thought that crossbows were simple, so he hoped he could use them a couple more times. Then someone approached him. Behind Clayton stood Guy, and the man said he clearly remembered that they had agreed to meet at the western gate, then asked why the guy was headed there. The protagonist stood behind the magician as he said that he had finally found them and had just run away from someone annoying. And he asked him again, to which the young man replied that it was nothing and suggested they set out on their journey. On the road, there were carts. The sorcerer sat opposite the guy. The bearded brunette looked away, thinking that 3 large carriages were enough to carry 5 or 6 people each, and that in addition, the coachman seemed experienced. Accordingly, the buyer had spent a lot. The young man looked anxiously at the mentor, who said it was not worth the trouble and that he had wasted a lot of money. Logan looked aside intently. Clayton sat with his arms crossed over his chest as the protagonist thought that this was not the first time he had met a very proud mage. The protagonist smiled broadly, thinking that since he had volunteered to go for free, it would be easy to sweet-talk him, and then said that he had some great mages with him, so what he did was only natural. The bearded man sat silently by the window. There was a full moon in the sky when someone said it was getting late, suggesting that they rest there before continuing on their way. A fire was lit. Logan sat near a thick trunk. The blade of a dagger flashed. The boy's eyes were closed. He tilted his head forward, dodging the weapon. People in hoods watched him as the protagonist asked who was there. The man's feet touched the grass as he exclaimed that he could not believe he had dodged it, and that it was very impressive for a young man. The bald man stood before the protagonist as he added that he had heard rumors about him in the capital, and then asked if it was true that he had made a lot of money selling some medicine. Logan was surrounded by bandits as he assumed they were thieves. The boy placed his hand on his belt as he exhaled, and replied that he wanted to try out what he had learned earlier. Calming himself, he drew the blade from its sheath. The protagonist stood upright holding his sword, basically congratulating the bandits, as they just signed up for his free training dummies. The unknown man gaped as he asked what he was talking about. The protagonist slit his throat. A body lay before the bandits and they cursed. A hooded man rushed toward the boy, wishing for his death. Logan bent his arm before him, staring ahead. The man with the knife opened his mouth wide. The boy struck him in the stomach, swinging the blade. He flew away from the protagonist. The bandits looked in one direction. The hooded man rolled his eyes. The bandits' comrades were lying before them. The masked man looked frightened as he cursed and said they were leaving now. He looked down at his feet, thinking about them and realizing that he could not move. The hand holding the sword began to blur into doubles. A male silhouette appeared behind the protagonist. His blade was wreathed in flames. His foot was pressed against the ground. Logan held the flame-wreathed sword before him. He struck the bald bandit with it, who screamed loudly. The guy frowned, staring ahead. The man looked at the blade in horror as the protagonist cursed, saying that it seemed hard to hold it for long. The protagonist lowered his gaze, satisfied. The bandit pressed his trembling hands to the ground as someone exclaimed that it worked. Logan gripped the blade in his hand as he thought that concentrating and compressing power through a new source would generate an aura. Bodies of the bandits lay on the ground as he thought about how the Duke had shown him a power sword that day along with the pressure blade, which was on a weaker level of aura. but he thought it was too early for him to try to replicate it. The protagonist looked at the blade with a flush as he said he could not believe he had managed to use the power blade even for a moment. The protagonist looked away seriously. He stood behind the crying bandit, who cursed and wondered what was holding him back. Tip of the sword touched the ground. The bandit gritted his teeth in fear. The boy walked toward him, thinking that using the force that emanated from the blade to forcibly scatter and overpower the enemy was characteristic of the pressure sword. Logan lifted his weapon with a smirk, saying he was skilled enough to wield it in a real battle. The bandits just realized he picked a fight with someone who treats murder as an extracurricular activity. Logan stood with the blade tip resting on the ground. Corpses lay scattered around as he wondered if he had gone too far. He looked startled when someone addressed him as young master, declaring that he had witnessed everything. A bearded mage halted before him, giving his name. A close view of Clayton's face made him question the anger there, guessing the man thought his handling of bandits too brutal, and realizing that if the sorcerer refused to cooperate, he'd be in real trouble. The man halted before him. Facing each other, the mage remarked that the young master had remarkable abilities. Sweat began to bead on Logan's face. Clayton spoke on, staring ahead, adding that though he knew little of force users, what he'd seen was enough to grasp how unusual it was for someone his age to do such a thing. He forced a thin smile and asked him not to be awkward, thinking that despite the stern look, he wasn't actually angry. He followed the robed sorcerer, surrounded by dense forest. He glanced aside, pondering why the man had deliberately left the camp to avoid being spotted by non-allies, whether he had come all this way to seek him out, and for what reason. The bearded sorcerer, shown in profile, said his followers were struggling because they hadn't been given the best instructor, so, while they were together, he wished to take over their training. Logan stood beside Clayton and replied that he was managing well enough, then wondered what exactly that implied. The man came to a stop, boots settling on the path. The bearded mage turned to the boy, saying that once they arrived and began work, he wanted breaks between shifts for training, then asked if it would be acceptable if he took on more duties in exchange. He stared ahead, nodded, and agreed, adding it was no problem. He looked down, thoughtful. Standing before the rogue mage, he pondered how mana rose from the earth and where it flowed. A brown aura wrapped the tent. With the flap slightly open, the boy realized the mages slept beneath that awning. Clayton's face ran with sweat as he addressed the young gentleman, who wondered why he was pushing so far. Logan smiled, saying he seemed to value his followers greatly. The dark-haired wizard closed his eyes and replied that since he called himself a teacher, he should at least give them the basics. The boy trailed the wizard, asking if it was too much to quarrel with the head of the tower for their sakes, to which he answered that the old man had misbehaved first. A flag fluttered in the wind. A grand castle came into view. He stood before his father's desk. The man said he understood and that he had gained much experience in the capital. His mouth fell open as he stared ahead and affirmed it, adding the trip had done him good, to which Patrick replied that in that case all was well, then asked if there was anything else to report. Logan gazed ahead, suspicious, wondering why the man was asking odd questions instead of getting to the point. His father looked concerned and asked again. The son said the business was going well and that profit would come soon. Patrick set his hands on the table and asked, "What business?" to which he answered that he had begun selling the medicine he'd given him. Patrick pointed ahead as he just discovered his heir was running a bootleg pharmacy for desperate nobles. He looked put out, standing before his father, who turned and said he remembered promising not to meddle in his affairs. Patrick brought a hand to his face and added that next time he should at least consider the reputation and dignity of their house, to which he agreed, thinking his father had taken it better than expected. Facing each other, the man suggested his son had agreed without much thought. He admitted he had, deciding he already felt his reputation being restored. A worried Patrick looked at his son, who said he'd also happened to meet the Duke of the Sword and form a connection. Then the man assumed he meant Felix. His father, shown in profile, asked if he'd sold that get your horsepower back pills to him too. Logan smiled brightly and said he had. Patrick gaped and asked how far he wished to ruin their house's reputation, to which the boy replied that in return he'd been given a fine mid-level sword secret technique. Then the man questioned him again. Patrick examined the blue book closely and said the Duke of the Sword had indeed given him a full-fledged iron blood blade technique. Smirking, he stared ahead, thinking it was a lie and that he himself had written the book while at the Duke of the Sword's estate. He pictured a man with a lantern, thinking of an imperial merchant discovering it in old ruins, and how it described a mid-level sword art. He imagined it passed from hand to hand, thinking how the merchant first copied the tome and sold a few copies. But the contents leaked, spread through the market, and soon the technique became public knowledge for knights across the continent. Logan, smiling in profile, thought this would occur in 10 years, and that if their knights learned the technique, the house's power would rise. He recalled the glow in his chest and himself gripping the sword, thinking of adding Blade's Kai and the secrets of the divine weapon to give his father and Rainian an edge. Looking ahead, indifferent, he considered how the iron blood sword technique sped the power, which could injure the insides during training, and how his father would never allow that. Thus, the Duke of the Sword's involvement would make him reconsider. Patrick opened the book before him and said it was now clear what would happen if they did. He looked at the tome with a smile, thinking these records were an order of magnitude better than theirs, and that their level was far higher. The book trembled in his hand as the father thought about how hard it was for nobles to acquire decent sword techniques, and how, for a time, he'd even thought that was why he hadn't progressed for 10 years. Logan watched Patrick exclaim that if their knights mastered it, the average level of the entire order would rise by 30%, then wonder how they could repay the Duke of the Sword for his kindness. His son opened his mouth, staring ahead, and said he had another proposal. Logan narrowed sharply as his father said he had to master it to at least repay him that way. He reached toward the man and tried to object, but the man shouted that they didn't have much time. Logan stared, confused, at the item tossed to him as Patrick exclaimed that mastering the technique was his priority, adding his son should handle things for now, at which point the son asked what he meant. Logan stared in shock at the seal in his hands as he realized, from selling medieval Viagra last week to running the family this week, God really speedrunning his character arc. He reached after the departing man who asked him to help Dwayne with his issues, adding he'd return once he mastered the technique, and then thanked him. He stood by his desk, turned to his father, and said he had something to tell him. He raised the seal before his face, realizing his parental controls just got disabled. Dwayne opened the doors, exclaiming he'd heard of the young master's success in the capital. When Logan said that was excellent, and that he'd handle everything while he trained, Dwayne's jaw dropped as he begged out for family's finances like some greedy parasite, adding it was urgent. Logan asked why funds hadn't arrived after winning the war, and why he was barging in like it was his own room. He covered his ears and said the man was noisy, while the Dwayne explained the sum wasn't enough to maintain the two fortresses, that the war had reduced their workforce, that there would be far less food this year, and that even the Kairos had stopped helping. The man folded his hands and asked the master for funds, adding he'd heard the journey had been successful. He smiled, eyes closed, and apologized, stating he'd spent it all. Dwayne knelt before him and protested, saying he'd earned several million, then asked how the boy had managed to burn so much in so little time. Logan looked down, satisfied. The manager looked up hopefully and said it wasn't funny. The boy glanced down with a smirk, sweat beaded on the man's face. The protagonist stood in front of him, nodding when he asked if it was true. Dwayne slammed his hands to the floor as he swore and demanded what the boy had spent it on. The protagonist answered, 1,200,000 on scrolls and mages, plus building supplies and food for their folk, so nothing remained. The manager stared ahead, then lifted his head to ask again, claiming a bit of food would not affect the people's welfare. Logan's jaw dropped as he said he spent 1 million gold on food. Before him on the floor sat Dwayne, who pressed him again. The boy explained that 1 million worth of food would go to their people monthly for a year. The manager gaped and asked if the young lord was mad. The protagonist figured this response was expected and that his view of him had not shifted much even after becoming a war hero. He shot the man a hard look and said he was rational, then asked whether it would suffice to feed the people. The answer was yes. Then came questions about the building materials and magic scrolls. Logan looked pleased when Dwayne guessed the young lord planned to build something, so the boy stated they would construct a dam. On a white notice was written a summons for labor duties in 2 weeks. An old man glowered at the Tesseron keep, saying it had finally come to this and that the nobles were wringing them dry. A dark-haired man clenched his fists by the McLean keep, shouting that summoning labor in the peak farming season was insanity and that if he went, his children would starve. Another man added they had barely escaped the battle alive, and now the feudal lord aimed to finish them himself. Someone ground his teeth, asking if they must choose between dying fleeing, dying working, or dying starving. The dark-haired man stared ahead, saying death would come either way, then asked what the others thought. A man brandished a pitchfork and said they had no choice. Someone hefted a shovel, shouting it was better to seize matters themselves. The armed commoners lined up, deciding to strike the feudal lord. They reached the gate when someone asked if all were here. Sweat beaded on a lad's face as he asked if they were truly doing this. He was told they were hunted like dogs stuffed with chaff for dinner, while the nobles lived at ease. A commoner stood with back turned as someone suggested that with this many people, it was worth starting a fight. A man eyed the bearded one, then pressed his lips and agreed they were right and should seize the chance. The commoner tightened his grip on his weapon, adding they ought to drag all the nobles out. The gate cracked open. Then someone announced it. The old man clenched his teeth, staring ahead. The armed men looked resolute. Dark figures emerged before them. A helmed warrior bellowed, ordering the knights to ready for distribution. The scribes rushed forward. The commoners looked baffled, asking what this was and that no one had said anything about giveaways. The old man looked aside, jaw slack, saying it was nonsense, and they knew what these aristocrats were. A heavy sack was thrust into his hands. Before him stood an armored knight who stated that, by order of the young master, those who joined the forced labor would receive a month's grain for the whole family, and the rebellion turned into Black Friday at Walmart. The men stared ahead in confusion as they were told to line up and warned that distribution would start now. Then someone asked if they were serious. Men ran forward, shouting it was real grain and that they would never go hungry again. Blessing God, the old man hugged the sack to his chest. His trembling lips pressed tight. A man, sobbing, cried out for the young master's Logan. The old man stood before them, repeating, "Long live Logan." The men glanced at each other, smiling like they hadn't almost burned the gate down 5 minutes ago. Onlookers watched commoners with food shout praises for Logan. Dwayne stared ahead, asking whether it was worth issuing a compulsory order to gather everyone, adding the boy could have simply asked them to come. The steward looked to the protagonist, who replied that not even a quarter would have come. After all, they did not trust aristocrats. As a man poured out grain, the protagonist reflected that nobles treated their folk as property, and that those with hearts believed their duty was to protect them. The dark-haired boy gaped, weeping, as Logan thought that, having lived as a mercenary in a past life, he knew that to commoners the only difference between a good noble and a bad one was who took more. A man held a handful of grain. The steward stood beside the young master, who said even his father valued knights over people, seeing them as the nation's strength. The protagonist lowered his gaze, adding this was why, despite the tight budget, he had kept the knightly order of 50 men, and then asked Wayne to consider for himself what the people thought of them. He looked ahead, mouth set, explaining that he had forced them to come and see how he treated them so they could be sure. Logan and Dwayne exchanged looks as Logan asked why he was staring at him like that. Dwayne grinned wide, saying he was simply surprised and that the boy never ceased to amaze him, concluding it was time to get used to it. The protagonist glanced away with a smile and told him not to be foolish, saying that so long as he trusted him, they could press on with the construction. Dwayne stood beside Logan, his voice cracked like a man watching someone set fire to his piggy bank, asking why he would spend $2 million on this venture and whether it could even be finished. Protagonist tilted his head and said he sounded like those two. Clayton and Hammer looked stunned as they asked if he truly meant to bore a hole through the mountain. Seated at the table before the gentleman, they asked if he would really divert river water there and even build a sluice. Logan, eating with eyes closed, replied it was possible and told them to do as he said. With food on his plate, the boy explained that McClann's lands were ringed by mountains and wastelands on all sides, and that the soil was barren. He raised a knife to the meat and added that even the low northern hills blocked the Luther River from flowing south. The mage and the craftsman watched him cut as the protagonist said they would therefore bore a great hole in the wild northern mountains so the river's water could pass through. The slice of meat split in two. Hammer looked at the protagonist and said it would be more convincing to tell them to dig under the mountain. The protagonist asked him to listen. Logan pictured the high peaks and explained they would make a tunnel 30 m wide with an outlet to the river at ground level to serve as a sluice, and that such a method was used in the West and called a reservoir. The protagonist lowered a thoughtful gaze, thinking this water control method would in fact become popular in the Empire in 20 years, and that he did not know the workings, but he had a dwarf master and a fifth circle mage with him. The sorcerer and the craftsman sat side by side. A white flag fluttered in the wind as the protagonist decided that, if these two succeeded, they would turn the western wasteland of their territory into arable plain. The bearded men were shown in profile as they said that even so, they must choose the site carefully because the land's condition mattered. Clayton gave the craftsman a studying look. The craftsman added that water levels and canals must be considered, and that to prevent collapse the tunnel should be arched, concluding that mages' help would be needed as well. The dark-haired sorcerer sat beside the dwarf, asked him to wait, and then asked if this was truly feasible. Then he realized he had spoken aloud. Logan sat before the men and asked the same question. Hammer stared ahead, mouth open, saying he had enough work now since they had only just begun digging. Then the master answered that this was why he had prepared magic scrolls and mages. The protagonist leaned toward the dwarf's face and asked him to pick which mountain would suit them. The craftsman then exclaimed he had suspected something was off since the boy treated him to fine food for free. The sorcerer looked aside, wondering if they could manage it. The bearded man opened his mouth. He stood before a steep cliff. People watched him, asking if this was magic and if they would be safe. The protagonist folded his arms across his chest as someone replied that, since the young master was there, everything would be fine. Hammer lifted a hand to his mouth as he addressed the mage, shouting that if he was ready, he could begin. Clayton was shown in profile as he nodded. The sorcerer had his back turned and pressed his palm to the rocky surface. Shards of stone burst in all directions while someone screamed. People started running from the sorcerer, telling him to watch himself because everything was collapsing. Logan watched from afar. Beside him stood a dwarf, who exclaimed that he had told him to be more careful and asked why he was showing off his power there. A magic circle appeared before the sorcerer as the protagonist reflected that, beyond strength, people can wield supernatural energy like mana, and how in his past life he could barely sense it, whereas now he felt it clearly. The magic seal was shown up close as he thought how the earth's force flowed from the mana circle in his heart, tracing the same intricate patterns again and again, rousing the stone wall. Logan smiled, unable to believe he was seeing it with his own eyes and wondering if the power core had sharpened his senses. Clayton averted his gaze and told the master to watch closely since he wasn't finished yet. The boy folded his arms and looked ahead. Broken stones lay around the wizard as he realized this was a different spell. The dark-haired mage opened his hand before him, then clenched his fist. The stones floated in the air in front of him. Sweat began to bead on the protagonist's face. A silhouette took shape from the shattered rocks as he realized the caster had gathered them together. The mound of boulders swelled. A vast shadow fell over the master and the dwarf. A stone golem stood before them. As the boy grasped what it was, Logan stared ahead in awe, saying it was incredible that a golem this size could be made without tools. Clayton stood before his creation as the protagonist thought that if they could craft a couple more, they would not only finish construction faster but might also boost their fighting power. The protagonist shut his mouth. A bearded wizard stood before him, and when Logan turned, asked what was going on. He seized the wizard's hands. Logan stared with a wild look and asked how many more golems he could make, while Wizard looked like a man being asked how many children he could pop out in a week. The stone creature was shown up close as Logan asked whether his students could do the same. The protagonist set a hand on the wizard's shoulder, and the man said yes, they could create golems, and that they even had a school for making these beings in the magic tower. The protagonist beamed at him and asked if that was true, to which the man answered that there was a catch. Clayton looked straight ahead and explained that the spell formula for a golem core was only available from the 5th circle, so the students would need mana stones, and even then they could make only very small, weak golems. The young master looked displeased as he considered mana stones. He pictured a blue crystal while it was explained that it is a mineral like orichalcum or mithril, infused with natural energy, which makes it rare, impossible to synthesize, and quite expensive, as it is often used to aid spells or to forge artifacts. A pensive Logan was shown in profile as he realized mana stones weren't cost-effective. Yet money didn't matter in wartime, deciding that if a small outlay could win the war, then it was worthwhile. The bearded wizard frowned at the youth, who asked whether his golem would be stronger with mana stones. The delighted protagonist imagined the stone creature as the man affirmed it, adding that its speed and strength would rise, and its duration would increase. The protagonist pictured himself as a beggar as the wizard explained that, since he was 5th circle, he would need a mana stone of the highest grade. Clayton stood before the master and added that even so, a low-level stone would suffice for a spell to make a 2nd circle golem, which could last 24 hours and be several times stronger than a normal person. Then the youth wondered why he felt obliged to spell out everything. Logan touched his face and looked away, thinking how a low-level mana stone cost a gold piece and how the cost-benefit ratio was too poor. He imagined a creepy golem and decided that for a short war like the last one, it would be extremely useful. Logan and the mage faced each other when the man began to mention what would happen if he were not a member of the magic tower. When pressed again, the mage asked him to forget it. Dwayne looked alarmed and said there was a monster. The stone creature was shown in profile. The golem struck the mountainside. Then the manager shouted that the monster was ruining their land. The protagonist stood by the half-crazed man and said he already told him it wasn't destroying but tunneling. Coward man ran toward the forest, exclaiming that he had to report to the master. Logan wondering how someone could be both a grown man and still have the survival instincts of a panicked chicken. A dwarf stood before him, and he asked him to take all the workers to the water channel, explaining there was no point leaving them to dig a tunnel when the monster would suffice. Logan stood behind the craftsman, who told the boys to stop acting like little ones, gather their tools, and head there. The dam was shown as it was explained they were making 3 structures, the first being the tunnel and the dam. Green grass lay on both sides of the water. Then it was said the second was a water channel that would bring river water to every corner of the wasteland. The mine was shown as it was explained the third structure was a cave, and that there were already results there while he was in Grand, since the workers had tackled it first. The protagonist looked up thoughtfully, recalling that after returning from the capital he had been busy building the dam, so he couldn't track the cave's progress, and deciding he should stop by tomorrow to see it. The next day a grimy man gripped his pickaxe. Hammer looked furious. Protagonist stood before him and asked whether they hadn't met before, then asked what he meant. The dwarf clenched his fist and demanded to know whose fault it was that he had to run back and forth from the mine to the water channel. The craftsman flung his towel to the ground, screamed that he couldn't do it anymore, and told them to just kill him. Hammer lay on the ground before the master and asked why he couldn't rest, whether the work would stop without him, and why he had to carry everything alone. Then someone said he was enraged and needed calming. Someone touched the weeping dwarf's shoulder. Smiling, Logan opened his palm and told the craftsman he understood him and every word, adding that he was doing a great job and that, therefore, he would handle all the organizational work from now on. A frightened Hammer lay on the ground and asked Logan again, who told him to use the chance to report on the work's progress. The dwarf pointed ahead and cried that he was trying to dump all the responsibilities on him. He was then told he had guessed it. Logan curled his little finger and said he truly promised that, once everything was ready, he could rest as much as he wanted. The satisfied protagonist looked ahead with a smile. The craftsman stared at his hand in fear, asked again, and told him to move away. The master squeezed his little finger and said he promised. Then he screamed that Logan would break his finger because somehow his pinky promise looked less like reassurance and more like a torture. Workers stood behind Logan, amazed at how brazen he was. The protagonist halted at the cave entrance, thinking the mine would now be developed faster than in his previous life, though he wasn't sure about the dam. He looked ahead in satisfaction and decided everything should work out. A sphere lay on the table before him as he was told the building materials would arrive without trouble. The youth smiled at the magic orb as the subordinate added that they had easily agreed on lumber for 100,000 gold per month. He answered that he understood and that it was good. Philip grinned broadly, saying that once they developed the mine and cleared the land, the area would be completely transformed and that he should visit him one day. Logan silently gazed at the sphere. Seated in a chair, he agreed and advised him to come next year, and the boy repeated it, saying he was curious why and assuming he wouldn't get an answer. The protagonist looked down solemnly and said there was a rumor that the ruling family had a problem. The protagonist stroked his chin when asked what it was, replying that he had heard of it at the house of the Duke of the Sword, and that he did not know the particulars, but it sounded serious. Logan lowered his gaze in focus, lips parted, as he told his subordinate to try to recon the situation while he handled other business, then reflected that, by the memories of his prior life, the king would die suddenly next winter and a civil war would erupt, yet the intel he had as a lowly mercenary might no longer apply. The young master kept his eyes down, standing straight as he reasoned that if the death were truly sudden, it would mirror the former life. If not, the timeline would shift, and as with the feudal war, he couldn't alter the civil war's timing without knowing the cause. His hand reached toward the flow of energy as he realized he could at least prepare ahead. He tightened his fist before him, deciding that House McClan would join the war that would upend the kingdom's order. Seated in his chair, gazing at the sphere, he told his aide to set aside funds as a reserve and purchase as many arms and armor as possible, enough to equip 1,500 men. Philip looked uneasy, saying that was no trivial request. The protagonist fixed him with a stare, saying it wasn't for knights but for common soldiers, then asked again, noting he thought the McClanes had barely 100. The bespectacled youth's jaw dropped as he wondered if the gentleman had lost his mind. The protagonist covered his ears, thinking it might seem odd, but many of their men had died in the last war. When he added that no one fully equipped their soldiers in war, Logan's eyes widened as he thought how that had badly cut the farmers' productivity, and how they needed to minimize conscription and strengthen their knights and regulars. He envisioned armored warriors and a plowman, concluding that arming vulnerable soldiers was part of his plan. Philip looked away, guilty, saying no. When the protagonist asked if he had ever been wrong, the protagonist smiled and looked aside, suggesting the subordinate do so. The bespectacled boy closed his eyes and answered that it was good and that he would also look into the rumor. The young master clenched his fist, thinking how great that was, and how their wealth would be backed by the mine, their food by the dam, and their troops by their arms. Logan grinned, staring ahead as he realized the main preparations for the advance were slowly but surely moving. Stacks of papers covered the desk. The manager stood behind the boy, asking him to read and sign them, adding he would leave the next pile there. The worn-out protagonist looked down, asking how long he'd been sitting with the documents. When Dwayne scolded him for signing them without even checking the contents, like he's giving autographs to fangirls, Dwayne looked up, thoughtful, and replied that it would soon be a month. Dwayne, gloating, pointed at the protagonist as he asked if he thought a lord's work took a day or two, to which he answered that he had never seen his father work that much. Logan looked stunned when the man answered in the affirmative, explaining it was because he had handled most of it himself. Dwayne stood before Logan, who asked why he had now dumped everything on him like a training or a free labor, and Dwayne told that, as the heir, he should be fully aware of which issues required attention. The door cracked open as the boy protested that he was not the heir. Then the man asked whether he truly thought anyone would believe that. They turned to the man who entered, who apologized, saying the matter was urgent. Kaisalan spoke about the craftsman. The protagonist looked ahead, worried, as he exclaimed that Hammer was trapped in a collapsed mine. The protagonist braced his hands on the table as he asked the worker again, who confirmed it, adding that one of the tunnels had caved in. The dumb Dwayne, in confusion, who have just discovered basic geography, has asked if there was even a mine on their lands, while Logan asked the extent of the damage and whether they had found Hammer's position. Dwayne looked at Kaisalan as he repeated his question, after which the man replied that about 50 m of the tunnel had fallen, so it was impossible to pinpoint it. A hand reached for the slammed door as the youth exclaimed there was no time to lose and that they would go there at once. The dumb Dwayne clenched his fist, swearing as he wondered where they had gotten the shaft. The sound of hooves rang out. The dark-haired worker turned. Looking back, a horse stood before him as he exclaimed that the young master had arrived. Then he was asked where the collapsed tunnel was. Logan strode past the man, who explained that upon entering it would be the middle of the three, adding it was the deepest. The worker watched after the protagonist as he said it was quite dark within. The protagonist stepped forward. His eyes glimmered yellow, sweat beaded on his face. The corridor lay strewn with rubble. Before the boy stood an old man who addressed the young master. Concerned, Logan looked ahead and asked everyone to stand back. He laid his hand on the cobblestone, eyes closed. A flame bloomed beneath his palm. He pictured the silhouettes of the crushed. An elderly man stood behind the master. And he reported that Hammer and about 10 workers had avoided the worst but were hurt. He was asked how he knew that. The mustached old man stared ahead intently as he was told it didn't matter, and asked how long it would take to rescue them. Then the subordinate said it would take 3 days to clear the fallen stones if all went well. Sweat gathered on the protagonist's brow as he thought that even the hardiest dwarf wouldn't last under the debris with wounds. The boy stood before the blocked passage, thinking that the more time slipped by, the slimmer their chances of surviving, realizing they had to save everyone as fast as possible. He stamped his foot. The workers stared ahead as their master said he thought this man was their only hope. The crowns of the trees were shown. Logan looked gravely at the man before him, who asked why he had called them. Behind Clayton stood his followers. The protagonist glanced askance and said he'd get straight to the point. The bearded wizard stood before him as he asked him to save Hammer and the workers trapped in the mine, declaring he would reward them generously. The dark-haired man's mouth fell open as he asked if there was a cave there, and if they were stuck inside. The mine entrance came into view as the wizard realized the dwarf had been busy running between the cave and the dam. The protagonist put his hand on his chest as he stood before Clayton, who agreed, saying the people were in danger so they would help. And he thanked him, adding he would surely repay the favor. The bearded wizard was shown in profile as he wondered why he had brought destructive magic scrolls but hadn't used them, and that it was because of the mine. Logan stood with his back to the wizard, who thought that if he'd kept it secret, it must be a very valuable site, and how he finally spoke of it to save a slave and a few workers. The young master stared ahead with confidence. The man opened his palm. The wizard raised his hands. Clayton frowned and said he would hold the tunnel, then asked the boys to use golems to clear the stones, and they agreed. The protagonist watched the young wizards. The wizard held a mana stone in his hand. Gry pressed the crystal to his chest as he cast the spell. Fragments of stone lay scattered on the ground. The protagonist stood straight, staring ahead. Golems formed before him as someone cried that the fallen rocks had become monsters. The bearded mage stood behind Logan, thinking he couldn't believe they had cleared several meters just by making golems. Then the man exclaimed that they didn't know what state they were in, so they should hurry. The stone creature thrust its limb forward. The golems shoved the rocks before them. The young gentleman helped haul the rocks. Clayton looked surprised. The protagonist turned his head aside as the mage thought about a noble hauling rocks himself to save those of lower rank, and how he'd never have believed it if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. The mage's pupils narrowed sharply as he thought on it, which wasn't shocking since it was him. The old man opened his mouth, looking ahead, and shouted that they had found them. The dwarf was pinned beneath some debris when someone shouted they were there. Logan crouched before Hammer. The artisan's eyes were shut as he realized they'd fainted from shock, and that luckily their wounds were minimal. The young lord looked down, worried. The golems were bearing the injured when the boy began to praise the heavens. The dwarf had a bandage on his forehead when asked if he had nodded off while using the scroll of destruction, to which he answered that he'd simply been overworked lately. The protagonist looked guilty before Hamar, who told him not to fret, saying they would restore everything soon. The protagonist looked up from beside the Hemmer's bed as he told him to just rest and not worry about anything until fully recovered, to which the dwarf replied the work was not hard and he could be back at it in a day. Logan looked at him with disapproval. Logan sat by the wounded man's bed as he asked if he really wanted him to rest. And asked if he would be fine otherwise because around him anyone will be working from their grave. The craftsman pointed at Logan, who asked him to rest and then gave him that face like he's about to hand him another blueprint and shout no matter what it took, he'll rest now. The protagonist held the door handle, marveling at magic and how with its help they had finished the rescue in 2 hours. Clayton appeared beside him and asked what he wanted. The bearded mage studied the protagonist and said the young gentleman's mind was remarkable, then pressed him again. The dark-haired sorcerer lowered his meaningful gaze. Logan looked aside uneasily, guessing he had learned about the gold, which was very possible since he was an earth mage, and he worried how much trouble it would be if others found out. Clayton stood next to the protagonist, who wondered if he would keep the secret, and the sorcerer asked why the boy had gone so far as to reveal the existence of the hidden mine and ask for help. The protagonist grew pensive, repeating the question in his head, and answered that it was because no one could replace Hamar. The boy parted his lips, deciding it was better to risk saving him, since without him the development of the mine would slow, affecting future plans. He pictured knights in helms battling. Logan was shown in profile as he said that if he couldn't protect his people himself, there would be no one left at his side. The bearded sorcerer looked away, weighing him, then turned to the young master and asked if he wanted to establish a magic tower on his estate. The protagonist stared in surprise as he asked again. The dark-haired mage stood before him and explained he thought it was time to start his own enterprise, and that this place seemed able to support a small tower. The protagonist regarded the man, who asked what he would say. Then the boy realized the wizard didn't seem to be joking, and he thought of a magic tower on their land. Logan's mouth fell open. He clenched his fist and exclaimed that it would be amazing. Clayton stood before the young master, who asked if his pupils would move in as well and how much support they'd need, to which he replied that of course they would stay with him. The pleased wizard placed a hand to his chest and added that, as for support, he simply asked to be provided with everything they required, concluding that he trusted Logan and his abilities. Bro forget to blink and then act shocked when his eyes start buffering. You really trust him with that much power? The dwarf watched the dramatic protagonist. The full moon lit the palace as Hamar asked the master mage if he'd also hit his head since he decided to trust Logan. Logan, completely missing the roast, said Hammer to go back and rest. Stretching out his hand, the dwarf said he was now fully recovered and ready to restore the tunnel. Standing before the hero, he added he would try to make up for the delay, to which the hero replied, "Fine, good luck." Hamar left the office. The doors shut. Frowning, Dwayne said it was time to tell him about the mine, and the protagonist told him to come in. He widened his eyes in astonishment and shouted to know when he had secretly begun developing it, and why he hadn't told him, to which Logan replied that he should forgive him, it had slipped his mind. Stretching out his hand, the man demanded, "What slipped your mind? How was that possible? And why had he hidden the mine so carefully? Was there a lot of iron or copper?" Grinning like the world's worst secret gold digger, answered that there was gold in it. Staring at him, Dwayne told him to stop joking, his greedy eyes already calculating how many wives he could buy. The protagonist asked why, and why that would be impossible. Frowning, he added that by his calculations it would yield 100 million gold a year. Why would he lie about something like that? The man looked at him, stunned, brain lagging like a broke calculator. Logan stood silent before him. He reached his hand toward him and called his name. The man began to topple, and the hero shouted for him to wake up. He couldn't kick the bucket now. Aside from that small incident, he thought the plan was advancing well. People marched forward. Sooner than he expected, they had convened a meeting again. The dam's construction was finished. Glancing to the side, the boy asked if he was sure the build should have taken 6 months and they had managed it in 3, to which the man replied yes, that was accurate. The protagonist listened and looked aside. This meeting was for a final check. The managers were present. The man breathed heavily. Good, it was said. Since everyone had gathered, he knew he had plenty of business of his own, but let them stay to the end to see everything. Frowning, the man muttered, "God, what a useless, grandiose dig." The dam appeared. It was said that as if bringing water from Luther and its influence on this wasteland would change anything, it would be better to spend the money repairing the southern wall. Looking straight ahead, the man asked why it had to be so long, to which he was told he didn't know. Grinning, he asked what he did know. Dwayne froze in amazement. Staring forward, he realized this dam wouldn't just irrigate the wasteland, it connected directly to the underground part of Lithua. If they could keep the channels supplied with water, wide-eyed, the man added, the wasteland could become truly fertile land. The hero looked away. People exchanged happy looks. It occurred to him that everyone from workers to mages had taken part in the build. Dwayne grinned. He noted that even the managers had come. Standing beside the man, the protagonist asked whether they should begin, and was answered approvingly. Arms crossed, the dwarf asked if they really needed to do it like that, saying they had everything set up and the workers could open and close the dam themselves. Grinning, Logan said the first time should be grand and memorable. They would show everyone on MCLAN's territory. The monsters stood near the dam. It was declared that this was exactly what they had crafted with their own hands. The man looked at him in surprise and shouted, "Oh, what is that?" Pointing aside, he added that he should look, monsters. Covering his face, the man said he'd seen this kind of magic plenty. Frowning, Clayton shouted for the gates to open. The golem stretched out its hand. It started to open the dam. The monsters tried lifting the gates with their hands. The hero watched silently. People stared at him in amazement. The man suddenly cried out. The golem stood by the dam. Why had they frozen? What was happening? Clayton smirked faintly. Looking at the gnome, he asked what he was doing. Was this a joke? Hamar answered that he had definitely ordered them to open them. He didn't know what the issue was. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist thought, damn, he stood before the man. In truth, he realized the golem's power was for show. In fact, about 100 workers were needed to handle those gates. Frowning, Logan thought that wasn't part of the plan. What should he do? Staring ahead, Clayton said that if the reputation of his golems was stained, then he promised, to which the golems replied that they really weren't able to lift the gates, and the hero turned. Scowling, he said to break them. The man asked again, surprised. Looking aside, the protagonist said they would build new ones later and he should break these. Clayton looked forward. The golem clenched its fist. He gave the order. The golem smashed the wall. The man stared and asked if they were seriously breaking the gate. The monsters pounded the gate. Cracks veined the wall. Suddenly, water burst from the holes. People gaped. The man stretched out his hand. The boy's eyes flew wide. Clayton stared ahead in silence. The hero lowered his head and smirked, looking down. People cried out, water, it was water. They had water, it worked. A river ran before them. It was said they had brought water to these lands with their own hands. Facing forward, the protagonist thought that now the food problem during the Civil War was solved. There was no need to rush the restoration. Next spring, they would begin farming. Suddenly, he exclaimed in surprise. Looking at the man, Logan asked again, to which Dwayne replied that he'd been very wrong and begged forgiveness. The hero grinned and said it was nothing. Why was a big man like him crying? Suddenly, he looked aside in surprise. Lowering his head, Hammer asked how long it would take to rebuild the gate, and the man answered he shouldn't worry, he would help. Approaching them, the protagonist said they didn't need it urgently, so they should rest a week, then finish the mining work, and another long weekend awaited them. The dwarf stared at him in surprise and asked again if a guy like him can say them to rest. Closing his eyes, Logan said, "Of course," then thought that after that they would have more work to do, proving once again that this man could hand out overtime shifts faster than he handed out thanks. River ran through the valley, and it occurred to him that many farmers would come to till the rich land, but it would be hard for them to come from the city each day. Looking ahead, the hero thought they should therefore build a new village where they could settle. Extending his hand, he said he was great at building, then thought, no, wait, that's not how to ask him. The dwarf looked over at him, hearing the address. Smiling, the protagonist asked what he thought. Building was difficult even for him. Yes, he said it was reasonable. He had never heard that dwarves excelled at it. Hammer glared at him and shouted what was he saying. The crafting of weapons should prove to him that dwarves were the best in that craft. The thought struck him that he'd been caught. Raising a finger, Logan said it was true, impressive, admirable. The dwarf answered he could praise him, but he wouldn't give him anything, and why had he suddenly started talking about construction? Closing his eyes, the hero answered that he was simply curious. While inside, creepily plotting like some landlord who just discovered free labor, and poor Hammer still believed he was about to enjoy a relaxing vacation. The protagonist frowned and shouted that they should listen. He spread his arms wide. It occurred to him that when they gathered to open the sluices, he had made two promises to the workers. First, anyone could work on the plains of the McLeans. People looked at him with joy. Second, they would receive tenancy rights to match their employment. The tax would be only 30%. Logan looked aside. The man smiled and asked if the river would truly transform their lands. He thought that if he announced this, even the vassals would not object. In recent weeks, it was heard that this was what to expect from Hammer. Seated at the table, the hero said to think he had already finished planning the town and modeling the houses. He knew he had picked the right gnome, to which Rick replied that it was remarkable. The protagonist looked at the gnome. It was said he hadn't expected him to take the job when he came to him a couple of weeks ago. At first, Hammer hesitated, but once he began, he showed excellent results. The settlement took shape. The roads would intersect and the spacing between houses would remain uniform. In each section there would be shared wells and latrines. Outside the town there would be a sewer to dispose of refuse. Hand to his face, Logan thought he had described as precisely as possible the layout of a city he had seen in his previous life. And now they could successfully found the largest settlement, the city of McClan. Staring ahead, he added that the goal now was to gather half the inhabitants of their territory. Looking at Rick, the hero asked why he smelled so bad. Rick snapped back. It was all because of him who turned him into a walking dumpster just for profit. Closing his eyes, he asked why. The medicine was in high demand. If not for it, he wouldn't have to suffer so much and someone else would take it. Frowning, the protagonist asked if he would ever knock, to which Dwayne replied that something else mattered now, Hammer, that dwarf. Smiling, he added he had just sent word that they could begin developing the gold mine. Sometimes later, holding gold in his hands, the man said these were rare nuggets from a cave. The protagonist drooling in amazement, hearing that they usually had to obtain them in small amounts from ore, but they had already found pieces like these. Smiling, he answered it was great work, and Dwayne asked how they had gotten this lucky dwarf, to which the dwarf said thanks and asked if he could rest now. Looking at him, Logan asked how much they could dig. He replied he believed about a ton a month. Even conservatively, the mine would last 10 years. He could go rest now. Closing his eyes, the hero said that they had only just begun building the city. They'd need more crossbows, and the knights would also need new weapons. He asked what he could arrange. Hammer frowned at this. Kneeling, Dwayne said their treasure, and the protagonist thought they still had plenty to do. Hammer really should rest. Perhaps he ought to hire another dwarf later. Folding his arms, he said fine, as promised he would give him a rest, but a whole month was too much. Surging forward, the dwarf shouted that he shouldn't look for him. He was going to sleep the whole month and bolted like a miner escaping overtime. Logan stared in surprise and asked what was wrong with him, though inside he was already calculating how to chain the poor guy back to work after vacation. Dwayne began to weep, saying that 100 million in gold. A ton of gold a month was 100 million a year. The greedy parasite looked like he was about to kiss the dirt where the gold veins ran. He added they were saved. They wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore. The hero thought he was crying harder than when the dam was opened. Grinning, he asked what, but understood that the mine belonged to him. The man looked at him in shock, hearing that, of course, he would give 30% as a tax. Grinding his teeth, he sighed. Rising, Dwayne said he believed he could handle everything. After all, the damned project was a success. So far, all his decisions had proved right. The protagonist looked at him in surprise, seeing that greedy Dwayne really trusted him, and thought he readily accepted the statement. People stood near the mine. It was said that, of course, it was worth ensuring the workers didn't blab too much. If word of the mine spread, it would cause trouble. Closing his eyes, the man said he would handle it, to which Logan responded approvingly and thought it was unusual. Looking away, he added that his father would be a problem. He had done many things on his own while he was away training. A week later, the hero bowed his head as walked along his father by Riverside. Patrick looked aside. The thought came to him that Logan had indeed become a professional knight. Grinning, the protagonist thought this was what he had expected when he gave him the iron blood sword technique, yet he had never imagined his skills would improve. There had been no progress for more than 10 years. Looking ahead, Patrick said he had done much while he was away. Looking at him, Logan said, "Well, if you had heard about my plans." Touching the water with his hand, the man said that to think water had appeared in this wasteland was real. Patrick grinned and added it was true. Grass sprouted on the ground, and he could sense his level rising and these lands transforming. Looking ahead, the hero heard that it was all thanks to him. He was far better than he. He smirked at that. Stretching out his hand, the protagonist said these were only recent achievements. His father answered no. What he had done in 3 months surpassed all his contributions in 30 years. Staring ahead, the man said he was blessed with a son like him. He thanked him. Smirking, Logan heard that he believed he could now trust him with the affairs of their house. He looked amazed upon hearing that he would be training the knights himself for now, and asked again. The hero placed a hand to his chest and said he had not planned to become a lord, to which his father asked what he knew, what he had learned during training. Lowering his hand, he added he had grown old. Looking ahead, the protagonist heard that although he had mastered the basics of the iron blood sword technique, he could not grasp the secret art at all. The man grinned, thinking that if he had taken it on when young, when his power had just awakened, it might have worked. Clenching his fist, the father said that with his current strength, whose flow had formed over so many years, he couldn't even create a core. Standing before the hero, he added that since he had given up, he thought his and Ronian's time had come. The protagonist stared in amazement, hearing that thanks to this he had finally pierced the barrier that had hindered him for so long. Taking him by the shoulders, Patrick said that now it was time for him to step back and train those who would open the way. Logan looked down. Closing his eyes, he agreed, then thought that since he said so, he had no choice. The man looked aside and said it was his turn. Marion held an umbrella in her hands, and it sounded like she would help Logan fulfill his role completely. She lowered her head. The hero frowned. He walked toward the woman. She extended her hand and said that his achievements were enough to see him as a reliable heir, and that she had previously wished success only for Ran, which is why she had fought with him. Bowing his head, the protagonist apologized, to which Marion replied there was no need to say sorry. Rather, she needed it. Staring ahead, she added that he had already apologized before, but she could not accept it then, that her stubbornness was at fault, and she hoped he would be generous and understanding. Logan looked at her in silence, half wondering how his stepmom changing from crazy bitch to a pussycat. The water ran on, and she said she had heard him teaching Rainian the art of the sword. Smiling, the hero answered that yes, perhaps that was his talent. Yet in only a week, he had formed a power core and already mastered the first form. Marion grinned and said she had not seen him so happy in many years. Standing before the hero, she added that she asked him to keep caring for him, that he would remain his younger brother from now on. Turning away, the woman said, "Well, it's time for me to go." The protagonist averted his eyes. Looking at her, Logan called out that parents should not use honorifics toward their children. Grinning, he added that from now on he asked her to speak to him informally like in childhood. Marion looked startled at being called mother. A tear slid down her cheek. The man turned around. He was smiling, looking at the hero. The hero regarded them silently. He was watching the parents.